Hey there, tonight we're diving into the steamy, flour-dusted world of a medieval bakery, where the truth is, the crackling fires and relentless work might just leave you craving the comforts of modern life. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now settle in, maybe turn on some white noise or grab your favorite blanket, and let's drift into tonight's story together. The rooster hasn't even considered crowing, yet when you're jolted awake by a clatter from the street outside. Welcome to your new life as a medieval baker, where the day begins at 2 a.m. It's a bit like being a rock star, minus the fame, fortune, and fun. Instead, you've got a grueling schedule lined up, one that involves more flour in your lungs than a dust storm in the desert. As you stumble out of bed, you might be tempted to romanticize this moment. After all, isn't there something charming about a village baker kneading dough as the world sleeps? Well, hold on to that thought, because the reality's about to need you right back. You see, the medieval baker's life wasn't a quaint vignette from a storybook. It was more like a poorly written endurance test. The first order of business is the oven, your fiery nemesis. This isn't your modern, dial the temperature and forget it kind of deal. No, we're talking about a brick behemoth that requires a wooden peel, something akin to a pizza paddle, to maneuver the loaves. The oven itself is wood-fired, of course, and if you're not careful, it'll singe your eyebrows off faster than you can say brioche. But before you even get to that oven, there's the small matter of dough preparation. Flour is the main ingredient, and here's where the economics of medieval life rear their head. Flour isn't cheap. In 14th century England, a bushel of wheat could cost you about 13 pence, and that's on a good day. Considering that the average peasant might earn around 2 to 4 pence per day, you can see why bakers weren't exactly rolling in dough, pun intended. It's a high-stakes game of supply and demand, with your livelihood riding on every loaf you bake. And speaking of stakes, let's talk guilds. These aren't just friendly neighborhood associations. They're more like medieval trade unions with a side of mob mentality. If you want to bake bread in any respectable town, you're going to have to get in with the local guild. They're the gatekeepers of the trade, setting prices, ensuring quality, and occasionally strong-arming the competition. On one hand, guilds protect you from the chaos of an unregulated market. On the other, they make sure you toe the line. Deviate. You'll find yourself out of business faster than you can burn a batch of bread. So, as you knead the dough, you're also kneading out the stress of meeting guild standards and balancing costs. It's a delicate dance, one that leaves little room for error. The myth of the jolly, carefree baker is just that, a myth. In reality, you're more likely to find yourself sweating bullets as you juggle the economics of your trade. Now, you might be wondering why anyone would choose this line of work. The truth is, medieval life didn't offer a smorgasbord of career options. If your father was a baker, chances are you would be too. Social mobility wasn't exactly the medieval strong suit. You were born into a life, and that life came with its own set of challenges and expectations. As the dough rises, you glance at the wooden peel, your trusty companion in this early morning ritual. It's a simple tool, but in your hands. It's the difference between a perfect bake and a charred disaster. You might even feel a sense of pride. After all, not everyone can handle the heat, both literally and metaphorically. But before you get too comfortable, remember, this is just the beginning of another long day. The sun hasn't even risen yet, but you're already knee-deep in the bread-making business. This is where the romantic notion of the medieval baker shatters like a poorly baked crust. It's not all sunshine and freshly baked bread. Instead, it's a lot of hard work, economic juggling, and a constant battle against time. Yet somehow, through the haze of flour and fatigue, there's a certain satisfaction in knowing that you're part of a tradition. It's not glamorous, but it's yours. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough to get you through another day in the bakery. Speaking of tradition, let's dive into the doughy details that make this medieval bakery run. You might think baking is just a matter of mixing flour and water, tossing it in the oven, and voila, bread. But the medieval kitchen is a battleground, where the ingredients are soldiers, and the baker is the general trying to hold it all together. First up, let's tackle the flour situation. In medieval times, flour wasn't a one-size-fits-all product. You had options, and those options were mostly dictated by your social standing, or lack thereof. If you were a noble, you'd likely be munching on fine white bread, crafted from the most refined wheat flour. This wasn't your average loaf. This was the artisan sourdough of its day, a status symbol that practically screamed, "Look at me, I'm rich." But for the masses, it was rye bread, barley bread, or even oat bread. These were the everyday staples, the medieval equivalent of store-brand cereal. Rye bread was especially common, dense, dark, and nutritious, if not exactly a taste sensation. Now, let's talk fermentation, that magical process where flour and water meet wild yeast and bacteria to become something greater than the sum of their parts. But in medieval times, this was less of a science and more of a gamble. You see, the concept of hygiene was as foreign as the idea of a 5-day workweek, so dough fermentation often involved some questionable practices. Bakers might leave dough out in open vats to catch wild yeast from the air, which sounds romantic until you realize that air also carried more than its fair share of dirt and germs. Think of it as baking with a side of microbial mystery. And then there's the church, the omnipresent institution that had a finger in every pie, or in this case, every loaf of bread. Holy days, of which there were many, dictated the flow of work in a bakery. During Lent, for instance, the demand for bread would skyrocket as people abstained from other foods, but the church also had a say in what you could bake and when. On certain feast days, white bread might be required for the masses, adding a layer of complexity to an already challenging job. The church's influence was like a medieval project manager, constantly changing the requirements and leaving you scrambling to meet the deadline. Now, you might think that all this would allow for a nice, orderly day in the bakery. A set schedule, some predictability, how quaint. But the reality was more like a never-ending episode of a medieval version of Chop. You were constantly juggling ingredients, trying to meet both the demands of the church and the whims of your clientele, all while keeping an eye on the guild's ever-watchful gaze. Leisurely, not a chance. The bakery was a pressure cooker, and you were the chef trying not to get burned. But here's where the romance sneaks back in. Despite the chaos, despite the grime and the relentless pace, there's something undeniably appealing about the idea of a medieval bakery. The smell of fresh bread wafting through the village, the sense of community as people gathered to buy their daily loaves, it paints quite the picture. Yet, as lovely as that image is, it's just one slice of the loaf. The rest is a complicated tapestry of labor, economics, and a touch of divine intervention. So, as you stand there in the pre-dawn light, stirring a cauldron of bubbling dough, remember that you're not just making bread. You're crafting a piece of history, one that will feed your neighbors, and in a way, sustain the very fabric of medieval society. It's not glamorous, and it's certainly not easy, but it's a calling, a bread-and-butter testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Just be sure to keep an eye on those holy days, lest you find yourself on the wrong side of a bishop's bad mood. With the church's influence hanging over your shoulder like an omnipresent spectre, you might think that's enough social pressure for one bakery. But hold onto your bread peel, because we're diving deeper into the doughy depths of medieval social dynamics. Here's where your customer interactions are more than just a simple exchange of coin for crust. It's a full-blown societal chess game. Let's start with your clientele, stretching from the local lord, who might as well be a walking billboard for opulence, to the everyday peasant, who's more concerned with keeping the wolf from the door than the quality of the crumb. Now, bread isn't just bread. Oh no, it's a medieval status symbol. For the nobility, white bread was the equivalent of today's designer handbag, coveted and costly. Your average lord isn't popping in for a chat about the weather. They're here to make sure their loaf is as refined as their lineage. When the local bigwig swings by, you better have that fine white bread ready, or you'll be the talk of the manor for all the wrong reasons. Meanwhile, the peasants, bless their souls, are eyeing your cheaper rye and barley options. For them, bread is sustenance, not a status update. They don't care if it's the latest in bread fashion. They just want something to fill their bellies. But don't be fooled into thinking they're any less discerning. Shortchange them on loaf size, and you'll have a mob outside your door faster than you can say baker's dozen. And speaking of loaf sizes, let's talk about the assize of bread and ale. This isn't some quaint medieval bake-off. It's a set of laws that govern the price, weight, and quality of bread, and trust me, it was as strict as a dietitian armed with a spreadsheet. Established in the 13th century, these regulations ensured that bakers couldn't pull a fast one on their customers by skimping on loaf size or using shardy ingredients. You see, in a world without Yelp or TripAdvisor, the assize was the medieval version of consumer protection. Now, if you think you can get away with a little creative accounting, think again. The penalties for shortchanging your loaves were severe. We're talking fines that could cripple your business, or even worse, the dreaded pillory, a public shaming device that made the Starks look like a piece of modern art. Get caught too many times, and you'd find yourself the star of the village's least popular show, complete with rotten vegetables as your co-stars. But why all this fuss over a loaf of bread? Well, in medieval times, bread was quite literally the bread and butter of society. It was the staple food, providing the bulk of calories for the average person. Mess with the bread supply, and you're messing with the very fabric of daily life. The assize ensured that bread remained affordable and accessible, keeping social order intact and your bakery in business. As you navigate these social and legal waters, remember that your role as a baker isn't just about baking. It's about maintaining a delicate balance of power and responsibility. You're feeding the community, yes, but you're also a cog in the wheel of medieval economics and politics. Every loaf that leaves your oven is a testament to your skill, your integrity, and your place in this intricate social web. And while it might be tempting to romanticize the idea of a village bakery as a quaint little corner of peace and quiet, the reality is as complex and layered as a good sourdough. You're not just baking bread, you're baking history, one loaf at a time. So the next time you slide a perfectly risen loaf out of the oven, take a moment to appreciate the weight of tradition and the myriad forces at play in your humble bakery. Now, let's not overlook the political aspect of your daily grind. Being a baker in medieval times meant more than just appeasing the local lord and keeping the peasants fed. You were also subject to the whims of the broader political climate. A poor harvest or a rise in grain prices could send ripples through your business, as your costs would skyrocket while the demand for affordable bread increased. And heaven forbid a war breaks out, as soldiers need feeding too, often at the expense of the local population. This is where the local guilds come back into play. They were the self-appointed bread czars, setting prices and keeping an eye on market fluctuations. They wielded their power with a particularly heavy-handed approach, ensuring that no rogue baker could upset the delicate balance they'd established. If grain prices surged, the guild would adjust bread prices to maintain a semblance of order. But if you dared to undercut their pricing to gain an edge, you'd be hauled before a guild meeting quicker than you could knead a batch of dough. In this sense, guilds were both a blessing and a curse. They protected you from the chaos of fluctuating markets, yet they also imposed strict controls that stifled innovation and entrepreneurship. Want to try your hand at a new type of bread? Better have the guild's blessing, or you'll find yourself blacklisted, forced to sell your wares in secret like some kind of medieval black market dealer. So, as you forge your path in this flower-dusted world, remember that your bakery is more than just a place where bread is made. It's a microcosm of medieval life, where social standing, politics, and economics collide in a heady mix that's as unpredictable as a medieval feast. You might have dreams of breaking free from these constraints, but for now, you're bound by the rules of this age-old game. And while it's not an easy life, it's one that's rich with history, layered with meaning, and kneaded into the very fabric of society. Now, just when you think you've got this bakery gig down, life throws a medieval curveball your way. You wake up one morning, ready for another round of bread and butter economics, only to find out the grain supply's gone on a bit of a holiday, and not the fun, beachside kind. Nope, this is the kind where a bad harvest or a blockade on a vital trade route means your flour costs are about to skyrocket like a medieval catapult. You might be thinking, why not just stockpile grain? Well, that's easier said than done when your storage facilities are as advanced as a squirrel's nest. Plus, let's not forget about spoilage. Grain doesn't exactly come with a best before sticker. You've got rats, mold, and the ever-present threat of it becoming a meal for the local insect population. In short, storing grain is like trying to keep water in a sieve. And then there's the little issue of price controls. Remember the assize of bread and ale, that medieval bread police we talked about. They're still lurking around, making sure you don't get too greedy. They set the maximum price for bread, and if the cost of grain rises, well, tough luck. you're stuck with the same price tag, which means your profit margins are about as thin as a communion wafer. In this economic nightmare, bakers had to get creative or face the prospect of tossing their career in the same cauldron as their failed loaves. Some turned to alternative grains, a sort of medieval version of going gluten-free. Rye, barley, and even oats became the unsung heroes of the bread world, stepping up to fill the wheat void. Sure, they didn't make for the fluffiest loaves, but desperation doesn't have time for gourmet. Meanwhile, trade routes were both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, they brought exotic spices and ideas, turning basic bread into something of a culinary adventure when times were good. But when the political winds shifted and routes were blocked by wars or bandits, your bakery felt the crunch, quite literally. Imagine having your livelihood depend on the whims of distant lords and the odd pirate raid. Talk about a recipe for stress. And let's not forget the ever-looming shadow of the Black Death. It wasn't just a casual guest appearance in the 14th century. It was the headliner, reshaping societies and economies faster than you could say plague doctor. As the population dwindled, so did demand, but that didn't mean life got cheaper. Labor shortages meant that those left standing could demand higher wages, putting even more strain on your already strained finances. It was a double-edged broadsword. Fewer mouths to feed, but also fewer hands to help. But here's the kicker. Amid all this chaos, the romantic notion of peasant bread starts to sound less like a quaint rustic delicacy and more like a bitter reality. You know, the kind of bread that's less about artisanal charm and more about survival. Peasant bread was often made from whatever was available, which could mean mixing barley with beans or even acorns. Yes, acorns, because desperate times call for desperate measures, and nothing says culinary delight like a loaf that could double as a doorstop. Despite this, the concept of peasant bread has somehow gained this nostalgic glow in modern times. We picture it as wholesome, earthy, and organic, a bread that speaks of simpler, better days. But let's not kid ourselves. Those days were simpler only in the sense that you could count your options on one hand, and better only if you managed to keep your head above the ever-rising tide of medieval hardships. In reality, peasant bread was the embodiment of making do, a testament to human resilience and the drive to survive no matter how bleak the pantry looked. It was rough, it was ready, and it was as far from the gourmet bread basket as you could get. Yet, it was also the lifeline for countless families, a staple that fed the body when little else could. So, as the sun sets on another day in your medieval bakery, you wipe the flour from your hands and reflect on the balancing act you've managed to pull off. You've navigated the economic minefield, dodged the pitfalls of price controls, and perhaps even survived the odd rat infestation. It's not glamorous, and it's certainly not easy. There's a certain satisfaction that comes from knowing you've played your part in this grand historical saga. Remember, you're not just a baker. You're a survivor in a world where the next challenge is always around the corner, cloaked in the unpredictability of medieval life. And while the romantic tales of quaint village life might gloss over the gritty details, you know the truth. Behind every loaf lies a story of perseverance, creativity, and a touch of medieval madness. So, go ahead and take a bow, because tomorrow, the ovens will roar to life once more, and your daily bread will be more than just sustenance. It'll be a slice of history. As the embers cool and your muscles ache from a day of doughy warfare, it's time to reflect on the grand tapestry you're part of. Sure, today felt like a marathon, but let's zoom out for a moment and see how the medieval bakery was more than just a place to snag a loaf. It was a cornerstone of society, a yeast-powered engine that helped raise entire communities. Bread wasn't just food, it was a social equalizer, the great leveler in a world obsessed with hierarchy. Whether you were a king or a commoner, bread crossed class lines with the grace of a medieval diplomat. In the 14th century, an average English person consumed about 2 pounds of bread per day. That's one serious carb commitment. But this commitment wasn't just about filling bellies. It was about sustaining the very essence of medieval life. And let's not forget the technological marvels that came out of these ash-covered kitchens. The medieval period wasn't just a static era of gloom and doom. It was a time of innovation, especially in baking techniques. Consider the humble windmill, which revolutionized flour production. Before its widespread adoption, grinding grain was the medieval equivalent of a gym workout, labor-intensive and sweat-inducing. These wind-driven behemoths turned the energy of nature into the lifeblood of the bakery, making flour more accessible and, critically, more affordable. Fast forward a few centuries, and you see that these innovations laid the groundwork for the Industrial Revolution's mechanized baking. Imagine a world where the mass production of bread didn't require the daily grind of a sleep-deprived baker. The 18th century saw the rise of steam-powered mills, the ultimate game-changer, turning what was once a grueling artisan craft into a more efficient industrial process. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before steam took over, the medieval innovations were like the beta versions of the tech that would come to dominate the baking world. Now, let's tackle the myth of the idyllic medieval bakery. It's easy to imagine a quaint, rustic scene with flour-dusted bakers crafting artisanal loaves with love. In reality, it was more like a battleground for survival, with bakers juggling economic pressures and social responsibilities. The idyllic image overlooks the fact that bakers were essentially the frontline workers of their day, keeping society fed even as political and economic storms raged around them. Yet, this myth persists, perhaps because we long for a simpler time, a romantic vision that glosses over the back-breaking reality. And what about the bread itself? Modern bakers owe a debt to their medieval counterparts who transformed basic ingredients into something that was both a staple and a symbol. Bread was a canvas for innovation, with bakers experimenting with different grains, fermentation methods, and even spices as trade routes expanded. By the late medieval period, we see the emergence of more refined bread types, the precursors to today's diverse offerings. Your average loaf now comes with a side of choice: wheat, rye, multigrain, gluten-free, thanks to centuries of evolution that began in those medieval ovens. Yet, while we might romanticize the past, there's no denying the comforts of contemporary life. In 21st century Western countries, bread is often just a quick trip to the supermarket away, where a loaf costs you about $2.50 and comes in more varieties than a medieval baker could dream of. Refrigeration, preservatives, and industrial baking have turned bread from an essential daily task into a convenient commodity. You're no longer bound to the whims of the harvest or the local guild's pricing structure. Instead, you can enjoy the luxury of choice and convenience, luxuries that medieval bakers could scarcely imagine. So as you sit back and unwind from your imaginary day in the bakery, perhaps with a nice slice of sourdough in hand, it's worth appreciating the journey that loaf has taken. From the sweat and toil of medieval bakers to the marvels of modern technology, bread has been a constant, an unbroken line of sustenance and tradition. It's a testament to human resilience and ingenuity, a simple foodstuff that has sustained societies and bridged cultures. And as you take that bite, remember that you're not just eating bread. You're savoring a slice of history, one that's been kneaded and baked through centuries of innovation and adaptation. In a world where we often look for the new and exciting, sometimes the most remarkable stories are found in the traditions that have been with us all along. So here's to the medieval bakers who slogged through the night, to the innovations that turned flour into a staple of life, and to the simple pleasures that connect us to our past. Sleep well knowing that tomorrow's breakfast doesn't involve a 2 a.m. start or the threat of a guild fine. Thank goodness for that. Cyrus the Great, the gentleman who decided that ruling a single kingdom was for rookies, didn't just wake up one day and think, you know what would be fun? Building an empire that stretches from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea. Yet by 530 BCE, that's exactly what he'd done. We're talking about nearly 5 million square kilometers of land, give or take a few deserts and mountain ranges. To put it in modern terms, imagine being the CEO of a multinational corporation where every branch office is a different culture with its own language and way of life. Now, try imposing a single set of rules across that whole mess. Welcome to the early days of the Achaemenid legal system. Cyrus was no ordinary conqueror. He had a knack for governance that made him more of a benevolent landlord than a tyrant. His secret weapon, an almost charming level of pragmatism. He understood that to keep an empire together, you couldn't just march in, plant a flag, and call it a day. No, you needed a system of laws that people would actually follow, preferably without revolting every other Tuesday. So, what did he do? He went on a listening tour. Think less rock star and more policy wonk. absorbing the legal traditions of each newly acquired territory like a sponge at a legal conference. Now, you might be wondering how orderly things were before Cyrus decided to play lawmaker. Spoiler alert, it was chaos with a capital C. Imagine trying to organize a music festival with no schedules, no stages, and every artist playing different genres at the same time. Babylon had its code of Hammurabi, a delightful collection of eye for an eye justice from nearly 1,000 years prior. Meanwhile, over in Egypt, they were still deciding whether cats were guards or just really stuck-up pets. Into this legal free-for-all stepped Cyrus, armed with his own version of a greatest hits compilation, taking the best from here, the most sensible from there, and leaving the rest in the dust. Cyrus's approach was not without its hiccups, though. Initial attempts to impose order might be likened to those early experiments with electricity, shocking and occasionally disastrous. Picture this: a royal decree gets issued in Susa, but by the time it reaches Lydia, it's a game of telephone gone wrong, with the message transformed into all men must wear hats to court. And let's not forget the logistics of administering justice across such vast distances. Imagine trying to get a fair trial when your judge is a 3-month camel ride away. That's not justice delayed, that's justice lost in the mail. The heart of Cyrus's legal system was its adaptability. He was like the ultimate legal DJ, remixing local laws to fit into the grander imperial playlist. On one hand, this meant that each satrapy, or province, could maintain its local customs to a degree. On the other, it required a level of oversight that would make even the most dedicated micromanager break into a cold sweat. Cyrus appointed satraps, local governors who were his eyes and ears, but more importantly, his enforcers. These satraps were like the original middle managers, tasked with keeping the peace while ensuring that taxes flowed to the royal coffers with the punctuality of a Swiss train. As for the myth that Cyrus was some sort of ancient hero king, let's sprinkle a little reality on that romantic notion. Was he a progressive leader who respected the cultures he conquered? Absolutely. Did he also demand absolute loyalty and tribute from his subjects under penalty of swift and brutal retribution? You bet. The truth is, Cyrus was a complex figure, part visionary, part ruthless ruler, a man who knew that to keep a sprawling empire intact, you had to be both the carrot and the stick. To say that Cyrus's legal system set the stage for future empires is an understatement. His model of governance was like an ancient blueprint that Alexander the Great and even the Roman emperors would later crib from shamelessly. Yet, the early days were anything but smooth sailing. Trying to establish a coherent legal system across such a culturally diverse empire was like trying to write a user manual for a device that hasn't been invented yet. But through sheer determination and a lot of trial and error, Cyrus managed to lay down a legal foundation that would endure for centuries. So, what can we learn from Cyrus's attempts to wrangle his empire into legal coherence? Perhaps that the key to governing a vast and diverse empire is less about enforcing strict uniformity and more about finding a balance between local autonomy and centralized control. And maybe, just maybe, it's about having the audacity to believe that such a balancing act is even possible in the first place. In the grand tapestry of history, the rise of the Achaemenid Empire under Cyrus the Great is a testament to the power of ambition tempered by pragmatism. It's a story of how one man's vision and adaptability turned chaos into a functioning legal system, setting a precedent for empires to follow. But let's not get too starry-eyed. It was also a time when the rule of law was as much about power as it was about justice. And if you're a fan of historical ironies, there's plenty more where that came from in the chapters of this empire's storied past. Of course, while Cyrus laid the groundwork, it was Darius the Great who took the Achaemenid legal system from a patched-up quilt of regional rules to a full-blown imperial tapestry. If Cyrus was the empire's master chef, blending local flavors into a palatable dish, then Darius was the guy who opened a chain of restaurants and made sure everyone followed the same recipe. His reign, starting in 522 BCE, marks the point where the Achaemenid legal system became a bureaucratic symphony, or, depending on your perspective, a cacophony of paperwork and power struggles. Darius was the empire's legal architect, and like any good architect, he had blueprints. His plan, create a unified legal code to govern this sprawling empire of 44% of the world's population. That's right. Nearly half the globe's inhabitants were under his jurisdiction. But let's not get too misty-eyed over the notion of a unified code. The challenge wasn't just writing laws. It was getting them enforced over thousands of miles, across mountains, deserts, and seas. Picture trying to teach all of Europe to drive on the same side of the road, but in a time when roads were mostly dusty paths and cars were still horses. Darius set up a system of satrapies. Think of them as state-like entities, not unlike the states in modern federal systems. Each satrapy had its own governor, military commander, and tax collector. These officials were like the empire's version of a Swiss army knife, each handling multiple duties. And when you consider the size of some satrapies, it was like managing a small country. And here's the kicker. The satraps had to report back to the king, but not directly. They had to go through a chain of command that makes your average corporate org chart look like a doodle on a cocktail napkin. Darius was no fool. He knew that letting local customs and laws coexist with imperial rules was essential. This hybrid system allowed for regional autonomy while maintaining central control. And it's a big but, the logistics were mind-bending. The Royal Road, a 500-kilometer stretch from Sardis to Susa, was the backbone of this communication network. Imagine a postal service where the mail carriers are on horseback, galloping across hostile terrain, with messages that could take weeks to arrive. This was slow mail, ancient style, and yet it was revolutionary for its time, akin to the Pony Express on steroids. Now, let's talk about Darius's legal reforms. He wasn't just about maintaining order, he was about efficiency. The empire's tax system got a major overhaul. Instead of the arbitrary, tax-as-you-go method, Darius standardized taxes, demanding portions of the local produce, livestock, and even precious metals. If you think modern tax codes are convoluted, try wrapping your head around a system where your tax rate was tied to both your geographical location and the whims of the local satrap. It was a bit like filing taxes while blindfolded in a maze. Darius also introduced coinage across the empire, a move that would make him the darling of economic historians everywhere. The daric, a gold coin, became the standard currency, streamlining trade and taxation. This was a big deal. Before coinage, trade involved awkward bartering scenarios where you might have to trade goats for pottery. The introduction of a standardized currency was like switching from dial-up to broadband. Transactions became faster and more efficient. But let's not kid ourselves. Darius's reforms weren't without their snags. For starters, the notion of one law to rule them all ran into a wall of cultural resistance. Local traditions and laws were deeply entrenched, and not everyone was keen on swapping them for the imperial version. Plus, communication hiccups were the order of the day. In an empire where it could take months for a decree to reach the farthest provinces, it wasn't unusual for laws to become outdated before they even arrived. It's like downloading an update on your phone, only to find out your model no longer supports it. And then there were the administrative nightmares. Picture a legal system so vast and complex that even the satraps, those seasoned middle managers, had trouble keeping up. Corruption was rife, as was the occasional rebellion. Clearly, the carrot and stick approach had its limits when the stick had to travel 1,000 miles to reach its target. Despite these challenges, Darius's legal reforms made the Achaemenid Empire a model of administrative efficiency that other civilizations would envy. His innovations in governance were like a masterclass in ancient statecraft. Yet, beneath the veneer of order was a constant undercurrent of tension, a reminder that the empire's unity was as much about maintaining power as it was about fostering peace. So, was Darius the visionary who unified an empire under a single legal code? Definitely. Was he also the guy who had to deal with the bureaucratic chaos and resistance that came with it? Absolutely. The Achaemenid legal system under Darius was a testament to the complexities of ruling an empire where every corner had its own rules, but all were expected to dance to the same imperial tune. As we delve deeper into the saga of this ancient civilization, remember, the story of the Achaemenid legal system is far from finished. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the intricacies and ironies of this monumental chapter in history. As we plunge deeper into the mosaic of the Achaemenid Empire, it's time to hit the road. metaphorically, of course, and explore how this ancient juggernaut managed to keep its provinces from breaking into 1,000 tiny squabbling fiefdoms. Picture a colossal patchwork quilt, each patch representing a different culture with its own laws, customs, and a knack for resisting change. What you had was an empire as vast as it was diverse, a place where local customs didn't just clash with imperial laws. They threw a party and invited chaos as the guest of honor. Let's start with a pit stop in Babylon, once the crown jewel of Mesopotamia, now one of many provinces under Achaemenid rule. Babylon's legal system was a relic from the days of Hammurabi, and the locals weren't exactly thrilled at the idea of swapping their traditional laws for a new Persian version. Imagine trying to convince a die-hard fan of classic rock to embrace techno. It's a hard sell. But here's the kicker. Darius and his satraps knew a hard sell when they saw one, so they took the path of least resistance. Instead of bulldozing over local laws, they allowed many of them to coexist with the new imperial edicts, creating a legal buffet where you could sample a bit of everything, so long as it didn't interfere with the main course, paying taxes and pledging loyalty to the king. Now, let's swerve over to Egypt, where the Nile had been flowing long before Darius's ancestors were even a twinkle on the horizon. Egyptian priests and bureaucrats were as much a part of the landscape as the pyramids and had been administering their own brand of justice for centuries. Darius, ever the pragmatist, took a page out of Cyrus's playbook and opted for a policy of live and let live. Egyptian laws continued to govern matters like marriage and property, while Darius's laws took precedence in areas critical to the empire's stability, like taxation and military service. It was a balancing act worthy of a Cirque du Soleil performance, and the fact that it worked at all is a testament to Darius's political acumen, or maybe just dumb luck. But wait, there's more. Let's not forget the Greeks, the empire's resident philosophers and occasional troublemakers. The Ionian cities along the Aegean coast had their own democratic traditions, and the idea of submitting to a distant king was about as appealing as a toga party with no wine. Here, the Achaemenid approach was a mix of carrot and stick. Local governance was often left in the hands of Greek tyrants who were loyal to Persia, essentially local strongmen with a Persian stamp of approval. In exchange for their loyalty, these tyrants were allowed to run their cities with a fair degree of autonomy, so long as they kept the peace and the tributes flowing. It was a bit like letting a teenager borrow the car, as long as they promised to fill up the tank and not crash it. So, how did these local governors, these satraps, keep the peace? Sometimes with clever diplomacy, other times with sheer desperation. The satraps were the original multitaskers, juggling roles as military commanders, tax collectors, and legal enforcers. They were the empire's middle management, constantly walking a tightrope between appeasing local elites and satisfying the king's demands. To keep things from falling apart, they often had to resort to creative problem-solving. Bribery, negotiation, and the occasional show of force were all part of the satrap's toolkit. If a province got too unruly, a few well-placed gifts to influential leaders could calm the waters, or at least buy time until the next crisis. The real magic trick, though, was the empire's legal flexibility, which allowed for this hodgepodge of local and imperial laws to coexist. It's a bit like a jazz band, where everyone plays their own tune, but somehow it all comes together. This flexibility was essential in an empire where the royal road stretched over 500 kilometers, and messages could take weeks to travel from one end to the other. It was a system that required patience, adaptability, and a good sense of when to push and when to let things slide. Myth has it that the Achaemenid legal system was a model of harmony and order, but let's not get carried away with the fairy tales. The reality was often messier, filled with power struggles and legal loopholes that would make even the most seasoned lawyers head spin. Corruption was a constant thorn in the empire's side, and local revolts were a frequent reminder that not everyone was thrilled with Persian rule. Yet, for all its faults, the system worked, most of the time. It was a testament to the power of compromise, a reminder that sometimes the best way to govern is to know when to bend the rules. In the grand scheme of things, the Achaemenid Empire was a legal experiment on a colossal scale, a testament to human ingenuity and the relentless drive for power. It was a time of grand ambitions and even grander failures, And yet, for a while at least, it all held together. As we journey through the provinces of this ancient empire, it becomes clear that the real genius of the Achaemenid legal system was its ability to adapt, to blend the old with the new, to create something that, while not perfect, was astonishingly resilient. So, what's the takeaway from this whirlwind tour of Achaemenid governance? Perhaps it's this. Real power lies in the ability to adapt and compromise, to recognize that sometimes the best way forward is to embrace complexity rather than shy away from it. The Achaemenid Empire was a tapestry woven from countless threads, each with its own story, its own history. And as we unravel the intricacies of this monumental chapter in history, we're reminded that the past, with all its triumphs and tragedies, is never as straightforward as it seems. Stay tuned for more, because the saga of the Achaemenid legal system is far from over. As we continue our epic sojourn through the Achaemenid Empire's legal labyrinth, let's pivot to a topic that would make even modern spin doctors gape in awe: the role of religion and royal edicts in shaping this grand mosaic of laws. You see, in an empire where the sun never set, because it stretched across so many time zones, having the divine right on your side wasn't just a nice-to-have, it was the ultimate trump card. Enter Zoroastrianism, the official religion of the Achaemenid rulers, which had as much influence on their legal system as it did on their mourning rituals. Zoroastrianism was the spiritual backbone of the empire, offering a cosmic stamp of approval on everything from military campaigns to tax collection. Imagine trying to sell a law without divine backing in those days. It's like pitching a movie to a studio without a single superhero or CGI explosion. The religion itself, founded by the prophet Zoroaster, was all about duality, focusing on the eternal struggle between good and evil, truth and lies. And who better to enforce truth than the king, who positioned himself as the earthly champion of Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of Zoroastrianism. It was a celestial endorsement that made royal decrees feel less like political impositions and more like divine mandates. Royal edicts were the Achaemenid equivalent of a presidential executive order, but with a bit more celestial pizzazz. These edicts, often inscribed on stone tablets or carved into monumental inscriptions for all to admire, the emperor's way of saying, "Hey, I'm not just making this up. I've got the gods on speed dial, and they agree." One such famous example is the Behistun inscription, a towering proclamation by Darius the Great himself, etched into a cliffside for all to see, or at least those with a penchant for rock climbing. This epic declaration was not just a list of laws or achievements. It was a carefully crafted piece of propaganda that linked Darius's rule to divine will, painting him as the chosen one in the cosmic battle of good versus evil. But let's not kid ourselves. Spinning these divine narratives wasn't without its contradictions and comedic moments. Take the case of Cambyses Roman II, son of Cyrus the Great, who allegedly violated Zoroastrian taboos by marrying his sister and slaying the sacred Apis bull in Egypt. While the historical accuracy of these tales is up for debate, the underlying message is clear. Even emperors had to walk a tightrope between divine favor and public perception. Cambyses' actions were seen as the ultimate royal faux pas, akin to a politician getting caught in a scandalous affair. The resulting PR disaster was a classic case of do as I say, not as I do, a lesson in how not to wield divine power. The Achaemenids were masters of the PR spin, a skill that would make modern media strategists green with envy. Need to justify a military conquest? Easy. Just declare it a holy mission to spread truth and order. Want to quash a rebellion? Frame it as a battle against chaos and deceit. The narrative was always the same. The king was the embodiment of order, the rebel was a servant of chaos, and the guards were firmly on the side of the crown. It was a rhetorical judo move that turned potential liabilities into assets, transforming the messy business of empire building into a divine crusade. But let's not gloss over the economic context of these divine mandates. To enforce laws across such a sprawling empire required resources, lots of them. The empire's coffers were the lifeblood of its legal system, funding everything from the construction of roads and fortresses to the salaries of officials and soldiers. And here's the kicker. While the empire's subjects might grumble about taxes, they also knew that these levies were part of a cosmic order. Pay your dues, and you're contributing to the divine mission of maintaining truth and order. Refuse, and you're on the wrong side of history and the guards. The influence of religion on the legal system was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it lent the laws a sense of legitimacy that secular decrees could never match. On the other, it created a moral framework that was often at odds with the practical realities of governance. For every decree that upheld truth and justice, there was another that smacked of hypocrisy, as rulers navigated the murky waters of power and piety. The result was a legal landscape riddled with contradictions, where the gap between the ideal and the real was as wide as the empire itself. And yet, for all these contradictions, the system worked, at least most of the time. The Achaemenid legal system was like a grand symphony, with Zoroastrianism providing the rhythm and royal edicts setting the tempo. It was a testament to the empire's ability to blend the divine with the mundane, creating a legal structure that was both aspirational and functional. The real genius lay in its adaptability, its ability to absorb local customs and traditions while maintaining a veneer of cosmic order. So, what's the takeaway from this celestial soap opera? Perhaps it's this. In the Achaemenid world, the line between politics and religion was as thin as a papyrus scroll. The divine was never far from the earthly, and the legal system was as much about managing perceptions as it was about administering justice. It was a world where the guards were always watching, and the king was their chosen instrument, a potent mix of power and piety that kept the empire's legal machinery humming along. As we continue our exploration of the Achaemenid Empire, remember this. The story of its legal system is not just a tale of laws and decrees, but a saga of human ambition and divine intervention. It's a reminder that the past is never as simple as it seems, that even the most straightforward narratives are woven with threads of complexity and contradiction. Stay tuned, because the saga of the Achaemenid legal system is far from over, and the next chapter promises even more intrigue and revelation. So here we stand, at the crossroads of history, staring at the Achaemenid Empire's legal system, a sprawling, complex creature that was as much a reflection of human ambition as it was of divine mandate. But before we wax poetic about its legacy, let's peel back the layers of myth and get our hands dirty with the gritty realities. First off, the romanticized notion of the Achaemenid legal system as a harmonious blend of cultures is a bit like calling a rock concert a peaceful gathering. Sure, there were moments of harmony, but they were often drowned out by the din of conflicting interests and power plays. The real miracle was holding it all together, an empire that spanned 3 continents, from the sands of Egypt to the icy fringes of Central Asia, home to more than 20 different peoples, each with their own languages and legal traditions. The Achaemenid legal system was less a well-oiled machine and more a rickety contraption held together by duct tape and divine intervention. Take the Royal Road, for instance, 500 kilometers of ancient highway that was the empire's lifeline. While it was a marvel of engineering for its time, it was hardly a bullet train. Messages took weeks to traverse its length, and by the time a decree reached its destination, it was often as outdated as last season's fashion. Yet it was this very road that laid the groundwork for the communications networks of future empires. Speaking of groundwork, let's not forget the satraps, those imperial middle managers who were the unsung heroes of the Achaemenid legal system. These guys were like the original human resources departments, juggling roles as tax collectors, judges, and military commanders, all while trying to keep the peace in their little corner of the empire. Their ability to adapt local laws to fit imperial decrees was a masterclass in bureaucratic juggling, a skill that future empires from Rome to Byzantium would shamelessly borrow. And what about those royal edicts? The ancient equivalent of shouting from the rooftops with a bullhorn. While they carried the weight of divine authority, they were also just as susceptible to the whims of rulers and the shifting sands of political intrigue. The Behistun inscription, that grandiose declaration by Darius, wasn't just about laying down the law. It was a PR move to solidify his claim to the throne. Every empire needs its mythologies, and the Achaemenids were no different, spinning tales as intricate as the Persian rugs they traded. Now, let's talk about the economic engine that powered this legal juggernaut. Taxes, the universal bane of humanity's existence, were as crucial then as they are today. Darius's standardized tax system was like the Swiss watch of ancient economics, precise, reliable, and occasionally infuriating to those who had to pay up. But it was this system that kept the empire's coffers filled, funding everything from grandiose building projects to military campaigns. The introduction of coinage, the daric, was a game-changer, transforming the Persian economy into a well-oiled machine, at least until the next rebellion or natural disaster threw a wrench in the works. For all its flaws, the Achaemenid legal system was a trailblazer, laying the groundwork for the notion of a unified legal code that future empires would emulate. Alexander the Great, that Macedonian whiz-kid, took a page out of the Achaemenid playbook when he built his own empire, adopting their administrative practices and even employing Persian satraps. The Romans, too, were keen students of Achaemenid governance, borrowing ideas about provincial management and legal uniformity. It's like the Achaemenids wrote the first draft of the How to Rule an Empire manual, complete with all the footnotes and scribbles in the margins. So, what's the takeaway from this epic saga? Perhaps it's this. While the Achaemenid legal system was far from perfect, it was a testament to humanity's unending quest for order in a chaotic world. Its legacy is one of resilience and adaptability, a reminder that the greatest empires are built not just on conquest, but on the ability to govern and integrate diverse cultures. It's a story that echoes through the ages, from the Roman legions marching across Europe to the bureaucratic behemoths of modern nation-states. In the end, the Achaemenid legal system was a grand experiment, a testament to the power of ambition tempered by pragmatism. It was a time when the lines between politics and religion blurred, when the rule of law was as much about maintaining power as it was about administering justice. And isn't that the eternal struggle of any legal system, balancing the scales of justice while keeping the wheels of power turning smoothly? As we wrap up this historical journey, let's raise a metaphorical glass to the Achaemenids, those ancient architects of empire who dared to dream big and more often than not succeeded against the odds. Their story is a reminder that history is not just a collection of dates and events, but a tapestry of human experience, woven with threads of ambition, ingenuity, and the eternal quest for justice. So, next time you find yourself grumbling about bureaucracy or the complexities of modern law, remember, we've been navigating these waters for millennia, and while the scenery might change, the currents of human nature remain remarkably consistent. You crack open your eyes to the sound of creaking wood and the smell of salt water mingling with the less than delightful aroma of several thousand unwashed bodies. Welcome to life aboard the Spanish Armada, circa 1588. Forget your curated Instagram feeds and artisanal lattes. This is a no-filter kind of morning, with the Armada's 130 ships scattered like unruly sheep across the North Atlantic, trying to make sense of the logistical chaos that is feeding and organizing 30,000 men. You thought your morning commute was bad. Wait until you hear what it takes to keep this floating armada from descending into utter pandemonium. First off, let's talk breakfast, or the lack thereof. You're not getting a bowl of organic granola here. Instead, brace yourself for hardtack, a biscuit so tough it could double as a building material. If you're lucky, there's a splash of wine to wash it down. But don't get too excited. This isn't a wine-tasting tour of the Spanish coast. It's more like swigging vinegar. The costs for provisioning this fleet are eye-watering, with estimates hitting around 10 million ducats. To put that into perspective, that's enough to make even the stingiest Renaissance-era accountant break out in a cold sweat. And about that army feel you might expect. It's more like a rowdy, poorly organized school trip. Discipline. Sure, they aimed for it, but when you've got sailors and soldiers from various regions, complete with language barriers and cultural clashes, the result is more miscommunication than military precision. This isn't a tidy parade of synchronized oars, it's chaos. The idea that the Armada sailed as one united force is a romantic myth we need to sink, much like some of the Armada's own ships. Let's dive into the delightful logistical nightmare of feeding everyone. Imagine trying to supply enough food and water for a small city, all packed into wooden ships that leak and sway. You've got salted meat that's more salt than meat, and barrels of water that might have started fresh, but are now breeding grounds for a new species of bacteria. And yet, this was the best they could muster. The harsh truth is that provisioning an armada was as much a battle as any fort with cannonballs. Just ask the quartermasters, who were probably the most stressed individuals on board, trying to stretch supplies meant for a couple of months into what felt like an eternity. Oh, and the political and economic stakes, through the roof. This wasn't just about naval dominance. It was about maintaining a Spanish empire that spanned continents. Philip Roman II wasn't playing games. He was making a power play. The Armada was supposed to be the hammer of God, smashing Protestant England into submission. But in reality, the hammer was more of a clunky tool, struggling to find its grip amidst storms and English sea dogs. Just imagine the pressure. You're not just some sailor, you're part of a divine mission, or so they said. The truth was a bit more complicated, and a lot less divine. As you try to navigate the chaotic morning routine, let's not forget the cultural mix on board. You have Castilians, Andalusians, and even some Portuguese, all with their own customs and languages. Communication was a mess, and cooperation was more wishful thinking than reality. So next time you hear about the Armada's glorious purpose, remember the internal squabbles and cultural clashes that made it feel less like a unified force and more like a dysfunctional family reunion. And what about those romanticized tales of sea battles and heroics? Sure, they happened, but the day-to-day reality was far grittier. Picture this. You're trying to keep your footing on a slippery deck while dodging the occasional bucket of waste tossed overboard. Hygiene wasn't exactly a top priority, and with limited fresh water, washing was a luxury few could afford. The only thing more crowded than the decks were the cramped conditions below, where you're heart bunking with several other sailors. Privacy, forget it. Comfort, only if you're comparing it to a medieval dungeon. Let's pause for a moment to debunk one of those romantic myths that persist about the Spanish Armada. The idea of impeccable Spanish craftsmanship and state-of-the-art ships. The reality, many of these vessels were hastily retrofitted merchant ships, not custom-built warships. They were heavy, sluggish in the water, and about as aerodynamic as a brick. The English, with their nimble, sleek ships, could run circles around these lumbering giants. So much for the unstoppable force of the Spanish fleet. The morning rush on the Armada was less about preparing for battle and more about trying to stay afloat, literally and metaphorically. The reality of managing such a vast fleet was a constant balancing act, with commanders juggling the demands of the day while trying to keep morale from plummeting faster than the Armada's dwindling supplies. You might be wondering, why did they even think this was a good idea? Well, hindsight is 20/20, but at the time, Spain was riding high on empire-building enthusiasm and a hefty dose of religious zeal. The romantic notion was that God was on their side. The reality check. Nature, logistics, and a feisty English navy clearly hadn't read that memo. As the sun climbs higher, the temperature on deck rises, and you're left with the stark reality of life at sea in the 16th century. This isn't a leisurely cruise. It's a grueling test of endurance. By now, you've probably figured out that the Spanish Armada wasn't quite the well-oiled machine of legend. It was more like a clunky contraption held together by ambition, desperation, and a fair bit of duct tape, metaphorically speaking, of course. So, as you stand on the deck, squinting at the horizon, remember this. The Spanish Armada was an epic tale of ambition and hubris, with enough drama to make a Spanish telenovela look tame. The next time you hear about the invincible Armada, take a moment to appreciate the real story, the one filled with logistical nightmares, cultural clashes, and the harsh slap of reality that awaited each sailor as they faced the day. Welcome aboard, and good luck surviving the chaos, because let's be honest, you wouldn't last a day in this maritime madness. As the sun climbs higher, and the afternoon heat sets in, you find yourself wondering how anyone signed up for this maritime disaster in the first place. You might think the Spanish Armada was just a bunch of ships sent off on a whim. But oh no, there's a Shakespearean level of drama behind those sails. Let's take a deep dive into the political intrigue, the religious fervor, and the geopolitical chess match orchestrated by none other than Philip Roman II of Spain. Picture Philip as a real-life supervillain, twirling his mustache, plotting not just England's downfall, but the Protestant reformations as well. His grand vision, a Catholic Europe with Spain at the helm, flexing its imperial muscles and showing off its divine right to rule. But let's not get too carried away by the romantic idea of a holy crusade at sea. Philip Roman II ambitions were as much about power and politics as they were about religion. This wasn't just about saving souls. This was about control, plain and simple. The Spanish Empire was a globe-spanning behemoth, and England was a pesky thorn in its side, supporting Dutch rebels and poking at Spanish interests like an annoying younger sibling. So, in Philip's mind, the Armada was the perfect tool to put England in its place and secure Spanish dominance. Except, spoiler alert, things didn't go quite to plan. Now, Philip wasn't alone in this grand scheme. He had advisors, generals, and a whole lot of people telling him what he wanted to hear. Classic case of the Emperor's new clothes, right? There's one name you should know, the Duke of Medina Sidonia. He was the poor soul entrusted with leading the Armada, despite his lack of naval experience. Imagine being handed the keys to a fleet of 130 ships and being told, "Good luck, don't mess it up." Yeah, no pressure there. Sidonia was a loyal subject, but he was also about as qualified to lead a naval campaign as a landlocked llama. And yet, here he was, steering Spain's hopes and dreams across the treacherous waters. One of the myths that need busting is the idea that the Spanish Armada was this invincible sea monster, an unstoppable force of nature. In reality, the Armada was more of a Frankenstein's monster, a cobbled-together assortment of ships, each with its own quirks and issues. While the Spanish had some powerful galleons, many of their ships were converted merchant vessels, not purpose-built war machines. They were slow, cumbersome, and about as agile as a hippo on roller skates, while the English ships were nimble and quick, designed for speed and maneuverability. So much for the invincibility cloak. And let's talk about the weaponry. If you're picturing rows of gleaming cannons ready to unleash havoc, think again. Spanish naval strategy was rooted in the old-school method of getting close enough to board enemy ships and engage in hand-to-hand combat. It was like bringing a sword to a gunfight, literally. While the English had developed more advanced artillery tactics, preferring to fire from a distance and avoid the messy business of boarding, the Spanish were still playing catch-up. Their tactics were about as outdated as using a flip phone in the age of smartphones. The Armada wasn't just a military operation. It was a floating symbol of Spanish ambition, and that came with a hefty price tag. The cost of launching this fleet was astronomical, draining Spanish coffers and stretching resources thin. We're talking about millions of ducats, money that could have been spent on, I don't know, anything else. But for Philip, this was a gamble worth taking. He was banking on divine intervention, confident that God would guide his ships to victory. Unfortunately for him, the weather had other plans. So, as you stand on the deck, squinting at the horizon and trying not to trip over the chaos around you, remember this. The Spanish Armada was a bold, audacious move, full of high stakes and higher risks. It was a tale of ambition and hubris, of men driven by a mix of faith, power, and desperation. The next time you hear about the invincible Armada, take a moment to appreciate the real story, the one filled with political machinations, technological shortcomings, and the harsh realities of 16th century naval warfare. Welcome aboard, and hold on tight. The real adventure is only just beginning. So, as you're gripping the railing, trying not to get tangled in the chaos of the Spanish Armada, let's peel back the layers of this floating brawl of cultures and ambitions. Imagine a social experiment where the lab is a creaky wooden ship, and the participants are a ragtag collection of soldiers and sailors hailing from every nook and cranny of the Spanish Empire. We're talking Castilians, Andalusians, Portuguese, and even a few mercenaries from as far afield as Italy and Flanders. It's like the United Nations of the late 16th century, minus the diplomacy. Now, imagine trying to get this lot to work together while surviving the mid-afternoon slump at sea. It's a miracle they didn't all just toss each other overboard in sheer frustration. Language barriers were everywhere, with dialects clashing like waves against the hull. Picture it, a Castilian ordering around a Portuguese sailor who barely understands a word, while a Flemish gunner grumbles in the background. It's not exactly the Tower of Babel, but it's close. The social dynamics on board were a simmering cauldron of tension and mistrust. The soldiers, many of whom were seasoned veterans from Spain's terrestrial campaigns, looked down on the sailors, considering them little more than sea rats. Meanwhile, the sailors, who knew the ropes, literally, saw the soldiers as landlubbers who were more likely to trip over a cannonball than fire it. The potential for conflict was as pervasive as the smell of unwashed bodies and rotting provisions. Speaking of provisions, let's address the elephant, or rather the rat, in the room, the food situation. With supplies dwindling faster than a bottle of seawater in the Sahara, tempers were bound to flare. Arguments over rations were common, with accusations of favoritism and theft echoing across the decks. A soldier from Toledo might find his hardtack mysteriously missing, only to discover it clutched in the grubby hands of a sailor from Lisbon. This wasn't just about hunger, it was about survival, and knives could come out over a crust of bread. Now, brace yourself for the brutal hierarchy that ruled this nautical madhouse. The Spanish Armada wasn't run like a democracy. It was more of a feudal kingdom at sea, with the captain general sitting atop the social pyramid, dishing out orders like a monarch. Below him were the officers, who wielded power with an iron fist, sometimes literally. Discipline was harsh, and often meted out with a brutality that would make a modern HR department reach for the smelling salts. Picture flogging as the Goda motivational tool, with lashes counted out in the dozens for offenses ranging from insubordination to mere laziness. The punishment wasn't just physical, it was psychological warfare. Imagine standing under the scorching sun, with your back bared to the whip, as your fellow sailors look on, some with sympathy, others with grim satisfaction that, at least for today, it's not them. This wasn't just about maintaining order, it was about instilling fear. And fear, as they say, is a powerful motivator, though perhaps not the most effective team-building exercise. Living conditions. Let's just say that even the most ardent patriot might reconsider their allegiance after a day or two below decks. Cramped doesn't begin to describe it. You'd be sharing your sleeping space with fellow sailors, packed like sardines in a barrel. Privacy was a laughable concept, and personal space was measured in inches, not feet. Hygiene was a distant memory, with the stench of sweat, salt, and sickness hanging in the air like an unwelcome guest that just wouldn't leave. Water was rationed, and washing was a luxury few could afford. Disease was a constant threat, with dysentery and scurvy lurking around every corner. In these conditions, even the most gung-ho recruit might start questioning their life choices. And yet, amidst the grime and the grumbling, there was a sense of grim determination. The sailors and soldiers knew the stakes, and while loyalty could be stretched thin, it wasn't entirely absent. This was more than just a military campaign. It was a test of human endurance and resilience. Each day was a battle against the elements, against the enemy, and sometimes against each other. The romanticized vision of the Armada, with its grandiose mission of divine conquest, starts to crumble when faced with the gritty reality of life on board. But these were the men who bore the brunt of Philip's ambitions, caught in a storm of politics and piety. For all the myths of chivalrous knights and noble sailors, the truth was grittier, dirtier, and infinitely more human. The Spanish Armada was a crucible, forging a story that was as much about survival as it was about conquest. As the afternoon sun dipped towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the deck, you'd be left with the inescapable truth. This was no place for the faint of heart. Welcome to the real Spanish Armada, where the legend meets the harsh light of day, and the myth gives way to history's gritty reality. And as you brace against the evening chill, remember, the voyage is far from over. The real challenges are yet to come. As the evening chill creeps in, you find yourself clutching the ship's railing, trying to imagine what's going through the mind of the Duke of Medina Sidonia. Spoiler alert, it's probably something along the lines of, "What fresh hell is this?" Because, my friend, you're approaching the English Channel, a seafaring arena that's about to transform from a strategic chessboard into a chaotic game of Twister, minus the fun, and with a lot more at stake. Let's dive into the tactical blunders that would make even the most stoic military historian wince. First off, the Spanish strategy was about as outdated as using a carrier pigeon in the age of email. The grand plan: form a crescent-shaped formation and hope to board the English ships for some up-close and personal swordplay. It's a bit like entering a Formula One race with a horse and cart, optimistic but wildly impractical. Meanwhile, the English fleet, led by the cunning Sir Francis Drake and Charles Howard, the Earl of Nottingham, were not exactly quaking in their sea boots. These guys were the seasoned pros of naval warfare, and they were ready to play hardball. The English fleet boasted around 200 ships, lean, mean, and built for speed. They had the maneuverability of a sports car, and a strategy that was less, let's get close, and more let's keep our distance and fire away. Now, about that weather. A lot of folks love to credit England's victory to divine intervention, a heavenly wind that blew fortune their way. But hold your holy horses. The truth is, while the weather did play a significant role, it wasn't because the Guards decided to join the English Navy. The Spanish ships were simply not built for the tempestuous conditions of the Channel. Their high, towering structures caught the wind like sails, or rather, like the sails they actually were. They were at the mercy of the elements, while the English ships, designed to cut through water with minimal fuss, danced circles around them. Consider this. The Spanish Armada lost more ships to storms than to English cannons. Nature was the great equalizer of the 16th century, and it didn't play favorites. But the English were quick to capitalize on their foes' misfortunes, seizing opportunities like a kid in a candy store, or in this case, like a pirate at sea. And let's not forget that the English had something else on their side: home advantage. They knew these waters like the back of their hand, while the Spanish were essentially trying to read a map in a foreign language. As the night settles in, the psychological strain on the Spanish crew starts to take its toll. The reality of their mission is sinking in faster than one of their leaking ships. The glory promised back home is beginning to feel like a distant, almost cruel joke. Picture the scene. Sailors whispering in hushed tones, wondering how they ever believed they were part of an invincible force. The propaganda back in Spain painted them as the hammer of God, about to bring the Protestant upstarts to their knees. Instead, they're facing the realization that they might be the ones kneeling. Morale drops lower than a lead anchor. These men were promised eternal glory, but what they're getting is a mix of terror, confusion, and the creeping dread that they might not see their families again. The very real threat of death looms large, not just from English cannonballs, but from the unforgiving sea and the even more unforgiving chain of command. The weight of Philip Roman II expectations feels like a millstone around their necks, and the cost of failure is unthinkable. As you watch the Spanish Armada fight against the tide, both literal and metaphorical, you start to understand the true psychological warfare at play. It's not just the enemy ships that are a threat, it's the creeping doubt and the realization of just how far they are from home. The gap between the romantic vision and the harsh reality is as wide as the Channel itself. In this theater of war, every mistake is amplified, every decision scrutinized. The Spanish commanders are faced with impossible choices, their plans unraveling like a poorly tied knot. They're juggling the logistics of a colossal fleet, the unpredictable weather, and the relentless pressure from an English fleet that's not just there to fight, they're there to win. And so, as the night drags on and the winds howl like a banshee, you realize that this isn't just a battle at sea, it's a battle of wills. The Spanish Armada might have been built on dreams of conquest and divine right, but the reality is a gritty, brutal fight for survival. The men on these ships are more than just sailors. They're pawns in a high-stakes game, caught in a storm of ambition and desperation. This is the true story of the Armada, where myth meets reality, and where the grandeur of empire crumbles before the unpredictable power of nature and human frailty. As the Channel churns beneath you, remember this. The Spanish Armada wasn't just a fleet. It was a floating crucible of human endurance, where legends were tested and history was made. And as the horizon darkens and the night stretches on, one thing is clear. The adventure is far from over, and the toughest challenges are still to come. As the night grudgingly gave way to dawn, the Spanish Armada was a battered shadow of its former self, limping away from the English Channel with more than just its sails torn. The invincible Armada had been schooled, not just by the English fleet, but by the merciless sea itself. The reality of this nautical debacle is a lesson in humility on a grand scale, where dreams of empire building were dashed against the rocks of practical reality. Now, let's tally up the cost of this maritime misadventure. Picture Spain's royal treasury as a piggy bank shattered on the floor. The Armada's price tag was a jaw-dropping 10 million ducats. To put that in today's terms, imagine a small nation's GDP sinking to the ocean floor. This was a financial sinkhole that left Spain wobbling like a top-heavy galleon in a storm. Economic ripple effects cascaded through Europe as creditors demanded their due, and Spanish silver shipments, the lifeblood of Philip Roman II ambitions, were increasingly at risk. The defeat was more than a military setback. It was an economic hemorrhage. And speaking of hemorrhaging, let's talk about the survivors. The romanticized tales of dashing escapes are delightful bedtime stories, but the truth is far grimmer. Forget the swashbuckling heroics. The survivors faced a brutal trek home. Shipwrecks littered the coasts of Scotland and Ireland like discarded toys, each telling a story of desperation and despair. For the sailors who made it to land, the welcome wasn't exactly warm. Irish locals, wary of Spanish intentions, often met them with hostility, and many were captured or killed. Those who did return to Spain were not greeted as heroes, but as reminders of a failed venture. The psychological toll on these men is another layer of this tragic saga. Imagine surviving the wrath of the sea and the enemy's cannon, only to return to a country reeling from your failure. No parades, no accolades, just the heavy cloak of national disappointment. The Spanish Armada's defeat became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the perils of overreaching ambition. Now, shift gears to the power dynamics of Europe. England's victory was a shot of adrenaline to its national pride, and a significant boost to its naval reputation. Elizabeth I's England was suddenly the David to Spain's Goliath, and the defeat marked a turning point in naval warfare. The English had demonstrated the power of speed and maneuverability, shifting the naval paradigm from the cumbersome, heavily armed galleons to more agile warships. The Armada's failure was the English fleet's triumph, and it set the stage for England's rise as a formidable maritime power. The broader European stage was equally transformed. Spain's aura of invincibility was punctured, and its influence began to wane. The Dutch, emboldened by Spain's setback, intensified their push for independence, and the Protestant Reformation gained a new lease on life. In essence, the Armada's defeat was a domino that tipped into a cascade of religious, political, and social shifts across the continent. But let's not gloss over the enduring allure of the Armada's legend. Despite the stark realities, the romantic image of the grand Spanish fleet persists, a testament to the human penchant for myth-making. There's something undeniably compelling about the tale of a mighty fleet setting sail under divine auspices, only to be thwarted by a plucky island nation and the capriciousness of the weather. It's a narrative that captures the imagination, even as it glosses over the gritty details of survival and sacrifice. The Spanish Armada's legacy is a tangled tapestry of ambition, innovation, and human frailty. It serves as a historical mirror, reflecting the timeless dance between hubris and humility. For Spain, it was a costly lesson in the limits of power and the unpredictability of fate. For the rest of Europe, it was a catalyst for change, spurring naval innovation and shaking up the geopolitical landscape. So, as you crawl into your comfy bed, snug in the knowledge that your biggest challenge tomorrow is probably a traffic jam or a missed deadline, spare a thought for those Spanish sailors. They embarked on a journey driven by dreams of glory, only to be met by the harshest of realities. Their story is a reminder that history is not just a series of dates and events, but a vivid tapestry woven from the lives and struggles of those who came before us. As you drift off to sleep, remember this. The Spanish Armada might have sunk, but its echoes still ripple through time, a cautionary tale and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. In a world where the most intense drama often involved the intricate politics of a tea ceremony, young Hirohito was a prince thrown headfirst into the swirling currents of Imperial Japan. Born on April 29, 1901, into a universe where the line between divine right and human fallibility was as thin as a sheet of washi paper, he had a childhood that would confound any modern parenting manual. Forget playdates and soccer practice. Hirohito's early life was a crash course in imperial protocol and the art of bowing at precisely the right angle to avoid a diplomatic incident. His early years were a dizzying carousel of tutors and traditions, with more focus on court etiquette than on, say, the actual running of a country. He was the first son of Crown Prince Yoshihito, later Emperor Taisho, and Crown Princess Sadako, who, in the grand tradition of this imperial theater, had more titles than a Netflix series. Hirohito was groomed from the get-go to become the Emperor of Japan, which, let's be honest, sounds a bit more intimidating than the usual childhood dream of becoming an astronaut or a firefighter. The young prince was educated at the Gakushuin Peers School, an institution that made Hogwarts look like a neighborhood public school. The curriculum was a blend of Confucian classics, military discipline, and Western science. It was like trying to balance a samurai sword on a microscope. But Hirohito had a brain that didn't just absorb this eclectic mix like a sponge. It marinated in it. While his peers were likely pretending to be samurai or playing with whatever passed for action figures back then, Hirohito developed a fascination with the natural world. And when I say fascination, I mean the kind of obsession that could make a marine biologist blush. His passion for marine biology was the kind of unexpected twist that makes history so much more entertaining than any scripted drama. Picture a young prince meticulously cataloguing seaweed like a 19th century Achaemenid collector. It might not scream future emperor, but it certainly added depth to his character profile. As Hirohito grew, his education became even more specialized. Under the tutelage of Count Nogi-Mersu, a military hero with a penchant for stoic silence that would make a mime look chatty, he learned the virtues of duty and sacrifice. Nogi, a man who had literally committed seppuku, albeit unsuccessfully, wasn't exactly the poster child for work-life balance advice. Yet, he was instrumental in shaping Hirohito's understanding of the imperial role as a symbol of national unity. Hirohito's adolescence was spent toggling between his burgeoning scientific interests and the increasingly complex duties expected of an heir to the chrysanthemum throne. His travels to Europe in 1921, a bold move for a Japanese prince, further broadened his perspective. For nearly 6 months, he toured the continent like an early 20th century exchange student, soaking up everything from European governance to the latest in zoological research. This trip was less about royal pageantry and more about absorbing the eclectic mix of ideas that were fermenting in post-World War I Europe. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the room, or rather, the sea cucumber. Hirohito's passion for marine biology wasn't just a hobby to impress the ladies at court. It was a lifelong pursuit. He published numerous papers on hydrozoans, which are tiny, jellyfish-like creatures that would probably make most people squeamish. This wasn't just a case of a prince dabbling in science. It was a full-on commitment. By the time he was in his early 20s, Hirohito had already contributed several significant studies to the field. In 1928, he even published a monograph on hydrozoans that was detailed enough to make any marine biologist's heart skip a beat, or perhaps a squiggle, given the gelatinous nature of his subjects. But let's take a step back and consider what this fascination with marine life says about Hirohito as a person. In a society where every move was scrutinized, where every decision was weighed against centuries of tradition, Hirohito found solace in the silent, undemanding world of the sea. It was a realm where the rules were dictated by nature, not by centuries of imperial edict. Yet, while Hirohito was busy categorizing sea creatures, the political tides in Japan were shifting. The Meiji Constitution of 1889 had established a parliamentary system, but it was about as democratic as a game of Monopoly where one player starts with all the properties. The real power lay with the genro, a group of elder statesmen who were the ultimate puppet masters behind the scenes. Hirohito's role, at least on paper, was largely ceremonial. But this was Japan, where the symbolic carried as much weight as the literal, and Hirohito's every move was laden with significance. In 1926, when Hirohito ascended to the throne following his father's death, the stage was set for a reign that would be both monumental and controversial. Despite his youth and scientific inclinations, he was now the 124th Emperor of Japan, a living god in the eyes of his people. It was a mantle as heavy as any crown. His reign, known as the Showa era, would become a period of dramatic transformation, marked by war, reconstruction, and rapid modernization. But at its dawn, it was still a time of relative peace, a calm before the storm that would engulf the world. So there you have it. Hirohito's early life was a blend of the traditional and the unprecedented, a narrative spun from the threads of duty, science, and the unyielding tides of history. His passion for marine biology might seem like a footnote in the grand story of his life, but it offers a glimpse into the mind of an emperor who would navigate the complexities of a turbulent century with both caution and curiosity. And while he would eventually become a figurehead during one of history's darkest chapters, these early years paint the portrait of a man caught between the old world and the new. prince who found comfort in the quiet contemplation of sea creatures, even as the world around him shifted like sand beneath the waves. As Hirohito took his seat on the chrysanthemum throne in 1926, it was like stepping onto a stage where the script was still being frantically scribbled by history's unpredictable hand. Here was a man who had spent his formative years more interested in hydrozoans than hierarchies, now thrust into the spotlight as the symbolic leader of a nation on the brink of immense change. But let's not kid ourselves. The transition from marine enthusiast to emperor wasn't exactly smooth sailing. The Japan Hirohito inherited was a nation in flux, a society caught between the allure of modernity and the weight of tradition. The economy was a roller coaster ride that even the most adventurous thrill-seeker might hesitate to board. The 1920 saw Japan experiencing a post-World War boom, but this brief prosperity was about as stable as a house of cards in a typhoon. By 1929, the global Great Depression hit, and Japan found itself not just in economic freefall, but in a nosedive worthy of a kamikaze pilot. Exports plummeted by more than 50%, a statistic that could make any economist reach for the nearest bottle of sake. The silk industry, Japan's golden goose, was cooked. Demand for this luxurious fabric dried up faster than a puddle in the Sahara. Unemployment soared, and rural poverty became a stark reality, with farmers facing a 60% drop in income. If you're imagining a nation teetering on the brink of chaos, you're not far off. Now, while most people will be reaching for a panic button, Hirohito, true to form, sought refuge in his beloved marine specimens. He might have been dealing with an economy as fragile as a sea sponge, but his passion for marine biology remained unwavering. It was his escape, a reminder that amidst the political squabbles and economic despair, there was still a world of order and beauty beneath the waves. But let's not get too swept away by this romantic image of a scientist emperor. Hirohito wasn't just a passive observer of Japan's political theater. He was an active participant, albeit one with a role as ambiguous as a politician's campaign promises. The Japanese political landscape was as tangled as a bowl of udon, with militarists and ultranationalists gaining traction amidst the economic turmoil. The military, sensing an opportunity, began to flex its muscles, seeing expansion as the ticket to economic recovery and national glory. Hirohito's position in all this was a curious one. As emperor, was the living embodiment of the state, a figurehead whose every move was scrutinized, and whose every word could carry the weight of divine proclamation. Yet, for all this symbolic power, his actual influence was as elusive as a shy octopus. The genro, those behind-the-scenes power brokers, still called many of the shots, but the military was fast becoming the loudest voice in the room. By the early 1930s, Japan's militaristic ambitions were in full swing. The invasion of Manchuria in 1931 was the opening act in what would become a larger drama of imperial conquest. It was an operation executed with the kind of precision you'd expect from an army that had been practicing its moves like a dance troupe. The so-called Mukden incident was a masterclass in political theater, a staged event that provided the perfect pretext for invasion. The League of Nations wagged a disapproving finger, but Japan shrugged it off like an unruly schoolboy ignoring the headmaster. And what of Hirohito during these turbulent years? While the military was busy carving out Japan's empire, he continued his double life as both emperor and marine biologist. It's said that he spent as much time in his laboratory as he did in the throne room, meticulously cataloguing marine life with the same diligence a general might plan a campaign. Perhaps it was his way of maintaining a semblance of control amid the chaos, a reminder that in the natural world, at least, there were rules and order. As Japan marched towards war, the emperor's role became even murkier. Was he a puppet, a pawn in the military's game, or was he an enabler, a willing participant in Japan's expansionist policies? The truth, like many historical questions, is wrapped in layers of ambiguity. Hirohito was no warmonger, but neither was he an outspoken advocate for peace. His position was one of careful balance, a tightrope walk between tradition and the demands of a modernizing, militarizing state. In the years leading up to World War II, Japan was a nation on a mission, and it wasn't exactly a mission of mercy. The country's aggressive expansion across Asia was driven by a potent mix of economic necessity and nationalist fervor. By the late 1930, the military had effectively taken the reins, steering Japan towards a collision course with the West. Hirohito was there, a witness to history in the making, his role still a subject of debate and intrigue. As we pause in this chapter of Hirohito's life, it's clear that the emperor was a man of contrasts, a blend of the scholarly and the sovereign, caught in the cross-currents of history. His reign during these years was one of upheaval and uncertainty, a prelude to the cataclysmic events that would soon engulf the world. Behind the scenes, amidst the political machinations and economic despair, Hirohito remained a figure of continuity, a constant in a world that seemed poised on the edge of transformation. And so, this tale is far from over, with more waves of change set to crash upon the shores of history. As the world poised on the brink of transformation, Hirohito found himself at the center of a storm that was about to redefine history's stage. When we talk about World War II, we can't ignore the attack that yanked America out of its isolationist armchair and into the global fray, Pearl Harbor. Ah yes, December 7, 1941, a date that lives in infamy, and not just because it ruined a perfectly good Sunday brunch for thousands of unsuspecting sailors. The romanticized version of Hirohito during this time often paints him as a passive figurehead, a marionette strung up by the military brass. But let's not kid ourselves. Even if he wasn't the puppeteer, he wasn't just a stage prop either. Hirohito was an emperor navigating a labyrinth of political intrigue, where the stakes were as high as Tokyo Tower, and the plot twists more frequent than a soap opera. The reality of Hirohito's influence, or lack thereof, over military decisions is as murky as the waters he loved to study. Sure, he wasn't sitting in the war room drafting battle plans with a pencil behind his ear, but he also wasn't entirely in the dark. Hirohito had access to top military officials like Prime Minister Heikki Tojo, a man whose mustache alone could intimidate a platoon. In the lead-up to Pearl Harbor, Hirohito was briefed on Japan's escalating tensions with the United States. However, the exact extent of his involvement in the final decision remains a puzzle wrapped in an enigma, tied with a ribbon of plausible deniability. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was a calculated risk, the kind that makes you wonder if the strategists were rolling dice behind closed doors. The plan was audacious, a surprise assault over 4,000 miles away, involving 6 aircraft carriers, 353 planes, and the aim of crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet in one swift blow. In terms of execution, it was as precise as a samurai sword slicing through a watermelon. In terms of long-term strategy, well, let's just say it didn't exactly pan out as intended. The attack galvanized the United States, uniting a previously divided nation and unleashing the industrial might of a sleeping giant. Hirohito, meanwhile, found himself in a war that was spiraling out of control faster than a typhoon. His role became even more intricate, like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube blindfolded. The emperor was a symbol of unity, but unity for a cause that was increasingly viewed as untenable. As the war dragged on, Japan's initial victories were overshadowed by a series of devastating defeats. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 was a turning point, a naval clash that saw Japan lose 4 aircraft carriers, and with it, the initiative in the Pacific. It was the kind of loss that would make any admiral reach for a stiff drink, or several. The tide had turned, and Japan was now on the defensive, a position as unfamiliar as a sushi roll at a Texas barbecue. Hirohito's role during these years was a tightrope walk of epic proportions. He was expected to maintain morale while the country faced rationing, bombings, and dwindling resources. By 1945, Japan was in dire straits. The American firebombing campaigns had reduced cities to ashes, including Tokyo, where an incendiary raid in March 1945 killed over 100,000 people in a single night. It was a level of destruction that made even the staunchest military leaders question the viability of continuing the war. Then came the atomic bombs, Hiroshima on August 6 and Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, ushering in a new era of warfare that was both terrifying and surreal. The devastation was unprecedented. Hiroshima saw approximately 70,000 people vaporized in an instant, with total casualties reaching over 140,000 by year's end. Nagasaki, though targeted by a secondary bomb, suffered similar horrors. The sheer scale of destruction was like nothing the world had ever seen, and it forced Japan to confront the stark reality of their situation. Hirohito, faced with the obliteration of his nation, did something unprecedented. He intervened. On August 15, 1945, he addressed the nation via radio, his voice heard by the Japanese public for the first time. In what became known as the dual voice broadcast, Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, citing the new and most cruel bomb as a key factor. It was a moment that shattered the illusion of imperial invincibility and marked the beginning of a new chapter for Japan. But Hirohito's story didn't end with the war's cessation. Oh no, the post-war period was a time of reinvention and rehabilitation, like a celebrity comeback tour, but with significantly higher stakes. General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of the Allied powers, decided to retain the emperor as a stabilizing figure for Japan's transition to democracy. It was a pragmatic move, one that recognized the symbolic significance Hirohito held for his people. The emperor's reputation needed a makeover akin to a reality TV transformation. Enter the Human Declaration of 1946, where Hirohito renounced his divine status in what was essentially an imperial rebranding exercise. He declared himself a mere mortal, a man among men, in a bid to help Japan align with democratic ideals and distance himself from the militaristic past. It was a bold step, akin to Superman admitting he's just Clark Kent after all. This declaration was part of the broader efforts to reshape Japan's national identity, a process that included drafting a new constitution. The 1947 constitution, largely written by American officials, effectively stripped the emperor of political power, reducing him to a ceremonial role, much like the British monarchy. Hirohito embraced this new reality, becoming a symbol of reconciliation and peacetime progress. But let's not rush to canonize him just yet. Hirohito's post-war image as a peace-loving figure was carefully curated, a combination of political necessity and personal evolution. He was a leader remade by history, his legacy rewritten in the aftermath of a conflict that had reshaped the world order. Yet the question of his wartime responsibility remains a topic of debate, like a historical whodunit with no clear resolution. As Hirohito transitioned into his new role, Japan itself was undergoing a metamorphosis. The post-war economic recovery, often dubbed the Japanese miracle, saw the nation rise from the ashes like a phoenix with a knack for manufacturing electronics. By the 1950s and 60s, Japan was a burgeoning industrial power, its cities rebuilt, its economy revitalized. Hirohito, meanwhile, became a symbol of this transformation, a constant presence as Japan navigated the complexities of the Cold War era. Hirohito's journey from wartime emperor to peacetime figurehead is a saga of contrasts and contradictions. He was a man caught between epochs, a leader whose life mirrored the tumult of the 20th century. As we pause in this chapter, it's clear that Hirohito's story is one of redemption and reinvention, a tale that defies easy categorization. The waves of history continue to roll, carrying with them the echoes of a reign that was both monumental and mired in ambiguity. And so, as we await the next installment, remember, history is not just a series of events, but a tapestry woven from the threads of human experience, each strand as complex as the emperor himself. As Japan began its post-war recovery, Hirohito found himself in a role more akin to a royal mascot than a monarch wielding any real power. Imagine going from the divine leader of an empire to a figurehead whose main duty was to smile and wave. It's not exactly the career trajectory you'd expect from someone once considered a living deity. But in this new Japan, Hirohito's transformation was symbolic of the nation's broader shift from militaristic ambition to democratic stability, a change as dramatic as a sumo wrestler taking up ballet. The post-war years were a whirlwind of change, like a 60s psychedelic rock concert where the hits just kept on coming. The 1960s saw Japan's economy roar to life, and by the 1970s, the nation was strutting on the world stage with an economic miracle that seemed almost supernatural. But unlike the divine intervention Hirohito once represented, this miracle was built on hard work, innovation, and a little help from some American economic policies. Between 1950 and 1973, Japan's GDP grew at an average annual rate of nearly 10%, a performance worthy of a standing ovation from any economist. Hirohito's role during this period was largely ceremonial, a constant reminder of Japan's storied past amidst its rapid modernization. He was a living symbol of the new peace and stability, attending international events and state functions with the enthusiasm of a teenager at a school dance. But let's not forget his passion for marine biology, which continued to be his anchor in these turbulent seas of change. Picture the emperor, clad not in imperial robes but a lab coat, peering through a microscope at sea creatures with the excitement of a kid spotting a rare Achaemenid. Hirohito's fascination with marine life was more than just a quirky hobby. It was a commitment to scientific inquiry that persisted throughout his life. He even published numerous papers on marine biology, contributing to the field with the kind of dedication that would make any academic proud. In 1965, Hirohito became a member of the prestigious Linnean Society of London, a testament to his scientific credentials and a nod to his lifelong pursuit of knowledge. It was a role that allowed him to escape the pressures of public life, diving into the depths of the ocean's mysteries, while Japan navigated the complexities of global politics. Back on land, Japan's economy was soaring higher than Mount Fuji, fueled by exports of cars, electronics, and steel. By 1968, Japan had surpassed West Germany to become the world's second-largest economy, a feat as impressive as a samurai winning a Western-style duel. The country's rapid industrialization was supported by an educated workforce, efficient production methods, and a government that knew how to play the economic game. In this new era of prosperity, Hirohito's presence was a reassuring constant, a reminder of tradition amidst the heady rush of modernity. Yet, while the economic miracle was nothing short of astounding, it wasn't without its dark side. The rapid industrial growth led to environmental degradation that would make any nature lover cringe. Pollution levels skyrocketed, with cities like Tokyo and Osaka shrouded in smog thick enough to cut with a sushi knife. The infamous Minamata disease, caused by mercury poisoning, underscored the environmental cost of Japan's industrial boom. It was a harsh reminder that progress often comes at a price, a reality as unavoidable as a commuter train during rush hour. Hirohito's role in this narrative was one of delicate balance. As the emperor, he was a symbol of unity and continuity, a figure who stood above the fray of political debates and economic challenges. His public appearances were carefully orchestrated, a dance of diplomacy and tradition that required the grace of a kabuki actor. Yet, behind the scenes, Hirohito's passion for marine biology offered him a refuge, a world where the rules were dictated by nature, and not the complexities of human society. But let's not get too carried away by this idyllic image of the emperor as a scholarly recluse. Hirohito was also a man of his time, navigating the shifting tides of post-war politics with the deftness of a seasoned sailor. He met with world leaders, from Richard Nixon to Queen Elizabeth II, bridging the gap between Japan's imperial past and its democratic present. It was a role that required both tact and humility, qualities that Hirohito seemed to possess in abundance. Still, the emperor's legacy was a subject of ongoing debate, like an unsolved mystery novel with no clear ending. His wartime actions, or lack thereof, remained a point of contention, a shadow that hung over his later years like a persistent rain cloud. Yet, Hirohito's post-war image as a peace-loving figure was a testament to his ability to adapt, to evolve with the changing times in a way that few leaders have managed. It was a transformation as profound as Japan's own journey from a war-torn nation to an economic powerhouse. So, as we pause here, remember that Hirohito's story is far from over. His life was a tapestry woven from the threads of history, each strand as intricate as the emperor himself. With the past behind and the future ahead, Hirohito stood as a symbol of Japan's resilience and adaptability, a nation that rose from the ashes to redefine its place in the world. And as we look forward to the next chapter, one thing is clear. The waves of history continue to roll, carrying with them the echoes of a reign that was both monumental and mired in complexity. Now, let's swim to the end of this historical ocean and dive into Hirohito's final years. As he aged, Hirohito embraced the role of an imperial figurehead with the same dedication he once applied to cataloguing obscure sea creatures. By the 1900 AD, Japan had transformed into an economic juggernaut, and Hirohito was the elder statesman presiding over this new era of prosperity. Yet, beneath the polished veneer of Japan's success lay the unresolved tensions of a legacy intertwined with war and peace. Hirohito's later years were marked by a kind of imperial retirement, although retirement for an emperor is more about exchanging one set of symbolic duties for another. Instead of wielding actual power, Hirohito became the nation's cultural ambassador, attending ceremonies, hosting state visits, and embodying Japan's historical continuity. It was like watching a rock star on a farewell tour, but with fewer guitar solos and more diplomatic handshakes. Yet, Hirohito's golden years were shadowed by the enduring debate over his wartime responsibility. The question of how much he knew and influenced during Japan's aggressive expansion and wartime atrocities is a historical conundrum that historians love to untangle, like a particularly knotty ball of yarn. Was Hirohito a puppet of the military, or did he pull some strings himself? The answer, frustratingly, isn't black and white, but a murky shade of grey, much like the Tokyo sky on a rainy day. The debate over Hirohito's wartime role was rekindled in the 1900 AD, when new documents and testimonies surfaced, hinting at a more active involvement in military affairs. Critics argued that Hirohito's silence during and after the war was a tacit endorsement of Japan's imperial ambitions. Meanwhile, defenders pointed to his limited constitutional powers and post-war efforts to promote peace as evidence of his innocence. The truth, as always, is likely somewhere in between, a perfect example of history being as clear-cut as a piece of abstract art. As Hirohito approached the end of his life, Japan itself was grappling with its past. The post-war period had been an era of rapid modernization, but the nation's historical amnesia was starting to wear thin. The younger generations began questioning the sanitized narratives of wartime history, demanding a more nuanced understanding of Japan's actions and the emperor's role. It was a national introspection that was as awkward as finding old, embarrassing photos at a family reunion. Hirohito passed away on January 7, 1989, at the age of 87. His death marked the end of the Showa era, a period that had been as tumultuous as a roller coaster ride through a storm. The transition to his son, Akihito, was smooth, but the event reignited debates about Hirohito's legacy. For many, he was a symbol of Japan's resilience and recovery, a figure who had overseen the nation's rise from the ashes of war to the heights of economic success. For others, his death was a reminder of the unresolved moral questions of the past. The Japanese government declared a national mourning period, and Hirohito's funeral was a state affair of unparalleled magnitude. Over 200,000 people lined the streets of Tokyo to pay their respects, and dignitaries from around the world attended the ceremony. It was a spectacle that highlighted Hirohito's enduring influence, a reflection of both respect and unresolved curiosity about the man behind the imperial mask. As Japan mourned, the nation was also forced to confront the complexities of its wartime history. Hirohito's death prompted a re-examination of the narratives that had shaped post-war identity. Was Hirohito a tragic figure caught in the currents of history, or was he complicit in the militaristic policies that led to devastation? This ongoing debate is a testament to the complexity of his legacy, a reminder that history isn't a simple tale of heroes and villains, but a tapestry woven from the threads of human experience. In the years following Hirohito's death, Japan continued its journey of reflection and reconciliation. The nation has made strides in acknowledging its wartime actions, though the process has been as gradual as a bonsai tree's growth. Memorials and museums now offer a more balanced view of history, showcasing both the achievements and the darker chapters of Japan's past. It's a step towards understanding that history is not just a series of events, but a mirror reflecting the best and worst of human nature. Hirohito's life and legacy serve as a poignant reminder of this complexity. He was a man of contradictions, a scientist and a sovereign, a figurehead during war and a symbol of peace. His reign is a case study in the challenges of balancing tradition with modernity, a lesson in the art of adapting to changing times without losing sight of one's roots. It's a narrative that's as relevant today as it was during his lifetime, a reminder that history is a living, breathing entity that shapes, and is shaped by those who inhabit it. So, as we draw the curtain on Hirohito's story, we're left with a rich tapestry of history that defies simple categorization. His life was a journey through the stormy seas of the 20th century, a voyage that saw Japan transform from an imperial power to a beacon of peace and prosperity. In the end, Hirohito stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a symbol of a nation's ability to rise, reinvent, and redefine itself. He was not just an emperor. He was a witness to history, a reminder that the past is never as distant as it seems, and that the lessons it holds are as vital as the air we breathe. Ever tried building an empire on a soggy swamp? That's precisely what a bunch of enterprising folks in the 5th century decided to do in what we now call Venice. Picture a series of marshy islands, more suited to breeding mosquitoes than fostering a bustling trade center. Yet, against all odds, this unlikely setting blossomed into the medieval equivalent of Amazon. Calm, a trade powerhouse that connected east and west like a high-speed Ethernet cable in a dial-up world. Venice, the city of canals and gondolas, started as a refuge for people fleeing barbarian invasions. By the late 7th century, when the Lombards were making life difficult on the mainland, those seeking shelter found solace in these unspectacular mudflats. Little did they know, they were laying the groundwork for a global trade empire. The lagoons of the Adriatic Sea, with their labyrinthine waterways, provided natural defense mechanisms. Not exactly a fortress, but if you're a marauding horde on horseback, waterlogged paths are less than ideal for a quick siege. Fast forward a few centuries, and Venice was cooking up a spice trade that would make any medieval chef weep tears of joy. Thanks to its strategic location, Venice became the middleman between the Byzantine Empire and Western Europe. We're talking about a time when getting your hands on pepper or cloves was like scoring a PlayStation 5 on Black Friday. Spices were the original luxury goods, and Venice was their Gucci store. The geographical advantage of Venice cannot be overstated. Nestled between the Adriatic and the Byzantine Empire, this city-state was perfectly positioned to dominate trade routes. By the 11th century, Venice had secured its role as the go-to port for goods coming from the east. Silk, spices, and precious metals were just the highlights on a list of luxury items that flowed into the city. The Venetians were like the savvy shopkeepers who always have the latest iPhone before anyone else, except their iPhones were exotic spices and silks that every European noble craved. This wasn't just luck, though. Venetian leaders were shrewd operators, adept at playing political chess. They knew that controlling trade required more than just good geography. It required cunning diplomacy and a touch of ruthlessness. Take, for instance, the Fourth Crusade, where Venice essentially hijacked a holy mission to sack Constantinople in 1204. That's right, the Venetians managed to turn a crusade, a religiously motivated enterprise, into a profit-making venture. Venice secured trading privileges and seized valuable booty, all while keeping a straight face about the whole holy aspect. The Venetians were also masters of what we might call today strategic partnerships. They knew that to dominate trade, they needed allies, or at least they needed to keep their enemies' enemies close. Thus, they formed trade agreements with the Byzantine Empire and later with the Islamic caliphates, ensuring that Venice remained the indispensable broker between East and West. And when diplomacy didn't cut it, a well-timed naval victory often did. Their fleet was no joke, boasting hundreds of ships at a time when your average kingdom might manage a couple dozen. By the 13th century, Venice was practically printing money. The Venetian ducat became the gold standard, literally. Introduced in 1284, the ducat was a coin of such reliable purity and weight that it was accepted all across the Mediterranean. This was a time when currency was as unpredictable as a toddler on a sugar high, so having a stable coinage was like having a superpower. Venetian merchants could trade with confidence, knowing that their money was good anywhere from Cairo to London. Now, let's talk about the myth of Venice as a serene city of romance and gondolas. Sure, it had its share of charm, but it was also a place of cutthroat competition and political intrigue. Think Game of Thrones, but with more water and fewer dragons. The ruling class, known as the patricians, were a closed club of elite families who controlled the wealth and power. They operated through a complex system of councils and committees designed to balance power and prevent any one family from getting too big for their breeches. The Doge, the elected ruler of Venice, was more figurehead than king, constrained by a web of checks and balances. Serving for life, the Doge was supposed to be the epitome of wisdom and selflessness. In reality, the role was part ceremonial, part political puppet. The true power lay in the hands of the Great Council, an assembly of the Venetian aristocracy. Meetings would have been less about grand speeches and more like a series of backroom deals, with decisions made over strong wine and even stronger personalities. The Venetians were nothing if not opportunists. When the Mongols opened up the Silk Road in the 13th century, Venice was quick to capitalize, establishing trading posts all the way to the Black Sea. They were like those savvy stock traders who always seemed to know just when to buy and sell. And sell they did, everything from salt and timber to those ever-precious spices that kept Europe's kitchens from being the blandest places on the planet. Of course, all that wealth and power came at a cost. The city of Venice itself was a marvel of engineering, built on wooden pilings driven into the lagoon bed. Maintaining this floating city required constant vigilance and innovation. Venetian engineers were the unsung heroes, figuring out how to keep the city from sinking while its economy soared. Water was both friend and foe, essential for trade, yet a constant threat to the city's existence. So, there you have it. The rise of Venice from soggy refuge to trading titan, a tale of geography, shrewd politics, and a fair bit of luck. As we delve deeper into the Venetian Republic's history, we'll explore how this maritime city-state continued to thrive against the odds, navigating the treacherous waters of medieval geopolitics with the same skill they applied to their gondolas. Stay tuned as we unravel more of the legend and the reality behind one of history's most fascinating economic powerhouses. And speaking of navigating treacherous waters, let's dive right into the golden age of Venetian trade, where the Republic didn't just play the networking game, they practically wrote the rulebook. Think of Venice as the LinkedIn of the medieval world, minus the unsolicited connection requests and motivational quotes. They understood that trade wasn't just about getting your hands on the hardest spices. It was about crafting a web of alliances, contracts, and yes, occasionally betraying a trusted partner if it meant a bigger profit margin. Now, let's get spicy, literally. The economics of the spice trade were as complex as a five-star restaurant's menu, and pepper was the crown jewel. At its peak, a pound of pepper could fetch around 2 grams of pure gold in late medieval Europe. That's like trading a bag of Cheetos for an iPhone today. This wasn't some casual condiment. It was currency, a status symbol, and sometimes even used to pay rent. The Venetians, ever the savvy merchants, cornered this market by controlling the pepper routes from the east. And how did they pull off this logistical miracle? With a fleet of ships that would make any admiral green with envy. The Venetian arsenal was the beating heart of this maritime empire, a sprawling complex of shipyards and armories that could churn out a fully equipped galley in a day. This wasn't just naval power. It was the medieval equivalent of having fiber-optic internet when everyone else was stuck on dial-up. By the 16th century, the arsenal employed thousands, making it one of the largest industrial complexes in Europe. Ships were produced with assembly line efficiency long before Henry Ford rolled out his first Model T. Speaking of power dynamics, let's talk about Venice's banking systems. Forget about Scrooge McDuck diving into a vault of coins. Venetian banking was more about credit and complex financial instruments than piles of ducats. The city's patricians were pioneers in using letters of credit, which allowed merchants to conduct business across vast distances without lugging around chests of gold. This was a game changer, like switching from carrying wads of cash to using a sleek credit card. Venice's financial acumen wasn't just about innovation, it was about survival. Operating in a world where piracy was as common as bad Wi-Fi connections, the ability to move wealth invisibly was crucial. This financial savvy laid the groundwork for modern banking, and the Venetian government even backed these ventures, providing a safety net that encouraged risk-taking. If Venice had been a modern startup, their motto would have been something like disrupt, dominate, defend. Now, let's debunk a myth. The idea that Venice was just a serene city of romantic canals and masked balls. Sure, there was the occasional masked revelry, but this was a city driven by commerce and competition. The real masquerade was in the boardrooms and council chambers, where alliances were as fluid as the canals. The Venetian patricians were masters of the long game, understanding that today's friend could be tomorrow's rival, or vice versa. While Europe was still stumbling through the Dark Ages, Venice was busy making trade deals with the Mamluks of Egypt and the Ottomans. Their ships sailed the Mediterranean like they owned it, because in many ways they did. The Venetians were pragmatic. Religion was important, but business was sacred. They made deals with Islamic powers even as the rest of Europe was embroiled in crusades. This wasn't just savvy. It was revolutionary, showing a level of realpolitik that would make any modern diplomat nod in admiration. And let's not ignore the human cost of all this prosperity. While the elite reveled in silks and spices, the workers toiling in the arsenal or navigating treacherous seas faced lives of hardship and danger. Venice's wealth was built on the backs of those who labored long hours, often in perilous conditions. Romanticize the grandeur if you must, but remember that behind every gilded facade lies a story of sweat and sacrifice. As we sail deeper into the intricate web of Venetian trade and politics, remember that this was a republic that thrived on balancing contradictions, a city that was both a democracy and an oligarchy, a haven of art and a hub of mercantilism. Stay tuned as we unravel how Venice continued to outmaneuver rivals and maintain its status as a powerhouse, armed with nothing but wooden ships and wits sharper than a merchant's knife. Ah, Venice, a city where the streets are canals and the lanes are navigated by gondola rather than Google Maps. But behind this picturesque facade was an intricate power structure that kept the city's economic engine humming like a well-oiled machine. Forget about the Doge being some kind of royal ruler draped in velvet and gold. The Doge of Venice was more like a diplomatic juggler, balancing the whims of the Great Council, the desires of the patricians, and the needs of the bustling mercantile class. A modern CEO might have more autonomy, but the Doge had a flair for the dramatic that would make any leader of today green with envy. In the Venetian political ecosystem, the Doge was elected for life, which sounds like a sweet gig until you realize it came with all the autonomy of a marionette. The real power rested with the Great Council, a body of around 2,000 aristocrats who were about as easy to manage as a herd of caffeinated cats. This council was responsible for electing the Doge and was the principal legislative authority, making laws that would keep the wheels of commerce turning. If you think your workplace has too many meetings, spare a thought for the Doge, who spent his days navigating a web of committees and councils, each with its own agenda. Now, let's debunk the notion of Venice as a perfect republic. Sure, it was a republic in the sense that it wasn't ruled by a king, but it was far from a paragon of democracy. The Venetian system was more of an oligarchic buffet, where a select few dined on the spoils of power while the rest were left licking the crumbs. Entry to the Great Council was restricted to patrician families, a sort of medieval elite club. If you weren't born into the right family, your chances of political influence were about as high as finding a unicorn in St. Mark's Square. But let's not paint the oligarchs as mere villains twirling their mustaches. They were savvy operators who understood that maintaining Venice's economic dominance required a delicate balance of power. The system was designed to prevent any single family from becoming too powerful. Think of it as a medieval version of checks and balances, minus the catchy slogans. This was a city where political intrigue was an art form, and alliances shifted like the tides. The patricians were like master chess players, always thinking several moves ahead, ready to sacrifice a pawn to protect the queen. And speaking of sacrifices, the Venetian Republic was no stranger to scandal. Corruption was as much a part of the city as its iconic canals. Take the infamous case of Marin Failure, the 55th Doge of Venice, who decided that perhaps being a puppet wasn't all it was cracked up to be. In 1355, failure hatched a plot to overthrow the oligarchy and seize power for himself. Spoiler alert, it didn't end well for him. The coup was foiled, and failure was executed, his portrait in the Doge Palace replaced with a black shroud as a grim reminder that Venice didn't take kindly to power grabs. Yet, it wasn't just power that was up for grabs. The city's bustling trade routes were a magnet for less than honest dealings. Smuggling and bribery were as common as pigeons in Piazus and Marco. The noble families might have had the official power, but the merchants wielded influence of their own, greasing the wheels of commerce with a well-timed bribe or a discreet shipment of contraband. The line between legitimate trade and illicit activity was often as murky as the lagoon itself. Despite, or perhaps because of, these less-than-savory realities, Venice thrived. Its political and social machinery was like a complex clockwork, where every cog, however flawed, played a crucial part in keeping the trade flowing and the ducats piling up. It was a city of contradictions, a place where democracy and oligarchy coexisted, where art and commerce flourished side by side, and where the facade of grandeur often masked a gritty underbelly. As we continue our journey through the Venetian Republic's history, we'll delve deeper into the forces that kept this maritime powerhouse afloat. From the bustling marketplaces filled with exotic goods to the clandestine meetings in shadowy alleyways, Venice was a city that thrived on chaos as much as order. So stick around as we navigate the labyrinthine canals of history, uncovering the myths and realities that made Venice one of the most fascinating economic powerhouses of its time. And remember, in Venice, the only thing more fluid than the water was the nature of power itself. So, where were we? Ah, yes, Venice, that shining jewel of the Adriatic, where power was as fluid as the lagoon waters. But let's hit the fast-forward button to the 15th century, where things start to get a bit dicey for our beloved republic. Picture Venice as the MySpace of city-states, once the Goda hub, now getting overshadowed by newer, shinier platforms thanks to a few game-changing events. First off, let's talk about the Ottoman Empire, the rising star that would give Venice a serious run for its money, literally. By the mid-15th century, the Ottomans had conquered Constantinople in 1453, turning it into Istanbul and effectively cutting off Venice's lucrative trade routes to the east. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was akin to waking up one morning to find your entire supply chain has been swallowed by a corporate giant. The Ottomans controlled the spice routes that Venice had once monopolized, and they weren't exactly in the mood for sharing. Economically speaking, the impact was brutal. Venetian merchants found themselves paying through the nose for the same spices they used to control, with prices skyrocketing like a Bitcoin bubble. At the height of its trade dominance, Venice had been handling an estimated 60% of Europe's spice trade. By the late 16th century, that number had dwindled faster than you can say Silk Road. With the Ottomans setting up shop as the new middlemen, Venice's profits took a nosedive, turning their financial statements from gold to bronze. But wait, there's more. As if the Ottomans weren't enough of a headache, along came the age of discovery. You know, that time when a bunch of European explorers decided to sail the high seas in search of new worlds. Enter the Portuguese, who, in the late 15th century, discovered a sea route to India around the Cape of Good Hope. This was like giving the Venetians a business card that said, "Hey, thanks for everything, but we'll take it from here." The Portuguese now had a direct line to the spice-rich east, bypassing the Venetian-controlled Mediterranean routes entirely. Vasco da Gama's successful voyage to India in 1498 was a particularly bitter pill for Venice to swallow. It slashed their share in the spice market like a ruthless cost-cutter. The precious cargo that once flowed into Venetian ports now streamed into Lisbon, leaving Venice looking like yesterday's news. In financial terms, the Republic's income from spice trade dropped significantly, estimated to have fallen by over 40% by the early 16th century. But don't start playing a requiem for Venice just yet. While the city's trading empire was taking hits left and right, Venice didn't just roll over and die. Instead, they pivoted like a startup with a failing app. The Venetians decided if they couldn't dominate the spice trade, they doubled down on what they did best: art and culture. Think of it as the city's rebranding as the cultural capital of Europe. In the arts, Venice found a new lease on life. The city became a vibrant center for Renaissance art and architecture, producing works that continue to draw tourists like moths to a flame. Titian, Bellini, and Tintoretto, three names that became synonymous with Venetian art, painted their way into history, turning canvases into masterpieces that were worth more than their weight in pepper. The architecture of Venice also took on a life of its own, with the iconic St. Mark's Basilica and the Doge Palace standing as testaments to the city's enduring grandeur. While the economy might have been faltering, Venice still had its wits about it. They invested in printing and publishing, becoming a hub for the dissemination of knowledge. The Venetian printing presses churned out books faster than 21st century tweet goes viral, making Venice a key player in the intellectual currents of the time. It was here that Aldus Manutius revolutionized the book world with the creation of italic type and pocket-sized editions, essentially the Kindle of the Renaissance. Politically, Venice was still trying to punch above its weight. The city-state used its fleet not just for trade, but to exert military influence, engaging in skirmishes with the Ottomans and other European powers. Despite losing the battle for trade supremacy, Venice remained a formidable naval force, boasting a fleet that was the envy of many a European power. In the grand scheme, Venice's decline was less of a fall and more of a strategic retreat. They had the foresight to recognize that, while the economic tides were turning, they still had cultural capital to burn. The city reinvented itself, focusing on the things that made it unique and irreplaceable. Venice might have lost its grip on the spice trade, but it maintained its allure as a city of art, culture, and, let's face it, intrigue. So, while the Republic's economic and political landscape shifted, Venice managed to keep its head above water, literally. From the rise of the Ottoman Empire to the discovery of new worlds, Venice faced challenges that would have capsized lesser states. But the Venetians, ever the opportunists, adapted, finding new ways to remain relevant even as the world around them changed. The city may have seen its economic power wane, but its cultural significance never really dimmed. Venice continued to be a beacon of art and innovation, a place where the old world met the new in a dance as intricate as a Tintoretto painting. And as we gear up to explore the final chapter of Venice's storied history, we'll see how this city woven from the threads of trade, art, and politics continued to navigate its way through the storms of change. Stick around, because Venice's story is far from over. Now, as we drift through the Venetian canals of history one last time, let's connect the dots between the Republic's illustrious past and the bustling, globalized world we know today. Venice, the once dominant mercantile powerhouse, might have lost its monopoly over the spice trade, but it sowed seeds that would sprout centuries later in boardrooms and economies worldwide. First, let's talk corporations. You know, those faceless entities we love to blame for everything from climate change to your favorite TV show's cancellation. Well, Venice was a bit of a trendsetter in this department, laying the groundwork for what we'd recognize as modern corporations. The Venetian trading companies were precursors to the joint stock companies that would dominate the economic landscape, allowing investors to pool resources and share risks. Imagine the East India Company or the Hudson's Bay Company, but with more gondolas and less gunpowder. The Venetians were savvy enough to realize that the key to sustaining their trade empire wasn't just about owning ships or controlling routes, but about organizing and financing trade efficiently. They were the early adopters of something akin to today's venture capitalism, funding expeditions that could make or break fortunes. They turned commerce into a team sport where the stakes were high, but the rewards were worth the gamble. Now, let's pivot to another Venetian legacy: banking. Venice's banking system was the medieval version of fintech, a complex network of credit, loans, and investment that kept the wheels of commerce greased. Venetian banks provided the kind of financial services that allowed merchants to trade without hauling around chests of coins. Letters of credit were their secret weapon, financial IOUs that let traders buy and sell goods across continents with the promise of future payment. This was revolutionary in a world where carrying your wealth in physical form made you a walking target for every pirate and pickpocket. These financial innovations were more than just clever accounting tricks. They were the building blocks of our modern financial systems, the ancestors of the global banks and stock exchanges that underpin today's economy. The Venetian concept of a stable, reliable currency, the ducat, was a precursor to the idea of a reserve currency, much like the U.S. dollar today. It's almost poetic how a small city-state in a lagoon influenced the financial fabric of a world it couldn't have imagined. But Venice's saga isn't just about what they left behind. It's a lesson in adaptability and resilience. As the city's trade dominance waned, Venice pivoted to culture and innovation, investing in art and publishing, becoming the Renaissance's glittering stage. This adaptability is a lesson for modern economies. We're talking to you, coal-dependent industries. Venice shows us that when one door closes, sometimes it's because you're supposed to knock on the one down the hall, labeled new opportunities. And what about those myths? The romantic tales of serenading gondoliers and masked balls. They're part of Venice's allure, sure, but they're also a reminder that every glittering facade often conceals a more complicated truth. The real Venice was a city of sharp elbows and sharper minds, where trade-offs were as common as trades, a place where the balance of power was as precarious as a gondola ride in a thunderstorm. It's a testament to human ingenuity and the relentless drive to thrive, even when the odds are stacked as high as the Rialto Bridge. Venice's rise and fall speak volumes about the cyclical nature of power and influence. They were innovators, risk-takers, and yes, sometimes opportunists who knew how to play the long game. In today's world, where economies are as interlinked as spaghetti in a bowl, the Venetian experience offers a cautionary tale about the dangers of over-reliance on a single industry or trade route. It's a reminder that today's edge can be tomorrow's downfall if you're not vigilant. Yet, the Venetian story is also one of inspiration. It's about what happens when a group of people refuse to let geography dictate their fate. They turned a swampy refuge into a thriving metropolis, a testament to human tenacity and innovation. Their story is a challenge to look beyond the surface, to see the potential in the unlikely, and to understand that history's currents are as unpredictable as the tides of the Adriatic. So, as we bid farewell to Venice's past, let's take its lessons with us. In a world that's constantly shifting, where new empires rise as old ones fall, the Venetian Republic reminds us that adaptability, innovation, and a dash of daring can keep us afloat. History isn't just a list of what was, it's a toolkit for what could be. And as we navigate our own complex waters, we could do worse than to take a page from Venice's book, even if that book is sometimes smudged with the ink of intrigue and ambition. In the end, Venice was more than just a city. It was an experiment in what humans can accomplish when they refuse to be defined by their circumstances. It was a place where art and commerce, politics and poetry all mingled in a tapestry as rich and varied as the city itself. And while the Republic may have faded, its spirit endures, whispering through the canals and echoing in the halls of modern economies. After all, sometimes the most enduring legacies are the ones that don't just shape history, but continue to inspire those of us living it. Rosa Luxemburg came into this world with the remarkable timing of a natural disruptor, born in 1871, the same year as the unification of Germany and the Paris Commune's brief, fiery existence. Zamość, Poland, her birthplace, was a picturesque yet turbulent spot, a fitting backdrop for someone who would go on to set the political world on fire. Her early life set the stage for a woman who would stride boldly into the male-dominated arena of revolutionary politics with the confidence of someone who's been told, "No, you can't," and responds, "Watch me." From the get-go, Rosa had a knack for making the improbable seem inevitable. Despite a hip ailment that left her with a lifelong limp, a condition that might have sidelined lesser mortals, she excelled academically. We're talking about a girl who had the gumption to master multiple languages like others collect stamps. Polish, German, French, Russian, and later, English. She wielded them like a verbal Swiss Army knife, ready for any intellectual skirmish. It didn't take long for young Rosa to realize that a small town wasn't exactly the epicenter of revolutionary thought. So, in true trailblazer fashion, she set her sights on Switzerland, a country famous for neutrality, but ironically teeming with radical thinkers eager to shake things up. By 1889, at the tender age of 18, she packed her bags for Zurich, a city that was, at the time, something of a socialist Hogwarts. There, the air practically crackled with the energy of ideas waiting to explode into actions. But why Switzerland, you ask? Well, Switzerland was a haven for those with big ideas and bigger ambitions, especially if those ideas were considered a bit too spicy for the rest of Europe. The universities, they were among the few that opened their doors to women, offering a sanctuary for minds like Rosa's that were unwilling to be pigeonholed by the constraints of their era. It was here that Luxemburg would earn her doctorate in 1897, a feat impressive enough to make her the first woman in Europe to achieve such a distinction in political science. Not too shabby for someone who had to fight just to get in the door. Now, if you think Rosa was content with just academic accolades, you're sorely mistaken. She had the soul of a rabble-rouser and a heart set on social justice. Her early involvement in socialist movements wasn't some passing fancy. It was a full-on commitment. By 1893, she co-founded the Polish Social Democratic Party, which was not exactly a move designed to win her any popularity contests with the ruling class. But then, popularity was never her end game. She was out to change the world, not win its approval. Rosa had a particular flair for stirring the political part, and she was just getting warmed up. Her writing was as sharp as a well-honed blade, cutting through political doublespeak with precision and clarity. She didn't just participate in debates, she dominated them, often out-arguing her older and more experienced male counterparts with a mix of intellectual rigor and sheer force of will. And the thing about Rosa was, she was never one to shy away from a good fight, whether it was standing up to the mainstream social democrats who she felt were selling out the cause, or critiquing the capitalist system with the cool detachment of a surgeon examining a tumor. She brought the same fire to every battle. Her arguments often left her opponents reeling, not just because of their potency, but because they were backed by a deep understanding of Marxist theory and a relentless drive for justice. Her early life was a testament to her resilience and determination. Despite the physical challenges, despite the societal constraints, Rosa Luxemburg was a force of nature from day one. She was the kind of person who didn't just talk about making a difference. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work, leaving an indelible mark on the political landscape. In the grand tapestry of history, Rosa Luxemburg's early years were the threads that hinted at the revolutionary masterpiece she was destined to weave. And so, armed with a doctorate in political science and the fiery resolve to upend the status quo, Rosa Luxemburg set her sights on Germany, the emerging heavyweight of European politics at the time. If Switzerland was the incubator of socialist ideas, Germany was the proving ground where theories were put to the test in the furnace of realpolitik. By 1898, Rosa had relocated to Berlin, a city that pulsed with intellectual fervor and political intrigue. This wasn't just a move, it was a strategic deployment. Germany's Social Democratic Party, SPD, was the largest socialist party on the continent. But size doesn't always equate to strength, and Rosa quickly realized the SPD was like a lumbering giant, occasionally stumbling over its own feet. The party was a paradox, a behemoth in numbers, but often timid in policy. It was more concerned with parliamentary games than revolutionary change. Rosa saw this not as a deterrent, but as an opportunity. She didn't just want a seat at the table, she wanted to flip it over and start anew. Rosa's involvement with the SPD was akin to a breath of fresh air, or perhaps a gust of wind that threatened to blow the cobwebs off the party's dusty ideals. Her critiques were sharp and unyielding, delivered with the kind of dry wit that left her opponents both infuriated and grudgingly amused. Imagine a party meeting where Rosa, with her keen insight, skewered the SPD's lukewarm policies like marshmallows over a campfire. She often referred to their cautious approach as revolutionary inaction, a term that was both a critique and an ironic nod to their supposed radical roots. Her writings during this period were a masterclass in polemics. She had a knack for distilling complex economic theories into punchy, digestible critiques that exposed the flaws in both capitalist and socialist dogmas. Take her famous critique of Eduard Bernstein, a leading SPD theorist who argued for a more gradual approach to socialism. Rosa's response was as pointed as a quill. If our movement goes down the path of reformism, we might as well replace our revolutionary anthem with a lullaby. Her words were a wake-up call, urging the party to remember its revolutionary soul. Luxemburg's talent for incisive commentary wasn't limited to written words. Her speeches were legendary, combining intellectual rigor with a flair for the dramatic. In one memorable SPD Congress, amidst debates over military funding, she famously quipped, "Why fund bayonets when we can fund ballots?" It was a rhetorical zinger that underscored her disdain for militarism, a stance she would champion throughout her life. Germany, at the turn of the 20th century, was a land of contradictions. It was an industrial powerhouse, yet plagued by social inequality. The Kaiser's militaristic ambitions cast a long shadow over a populace weary of conflict. Rosa saw the SPD's flirtation with militarism as a betrayal of its principles. She frequently clashed with party leaders over their support for increased military spending, warning that the march of militarism was a prelude to catastrophe. Her foresight was uncanny, a Cassandra-like ability to see the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. In 1914, when World War I erupted, the SPD made the fateful decision to support the war effort by voting for war credits. This was a bridge too far for Rosa. To her, this was the ultimate sellout, a capitulation to nationalism at the expense of international solidarity. Her response: she co-founded the Spartacus League, a radical faction dedicated to revolutionary socialism and staunchly opposed to the war. The Spartacus League was not just a political group, it was a statement, a declaration of independence from the SPD's capitulation. The League's meetings were a heady mix of passionate debate and strategic planning, often punctuated by Rosa's sardonic humor. In one instance, when a fellow member lamented the League's lack of resources, Rosa quipped, "We may not have funds, but we've got fire in our bellies and ink in our pens. Revolutions have started with less." Her words were a testament to her belief in the power of ideas over material constraints. Rosa's criticisms of militarism weren't just theoretical musings. They were grounded in the harsh realities of the time. The war was a brutal affair, costing millions of lives and leaving Europe in ruins. The economic toll was staggering, with military expenditures soaring to unprecedented heights. Germany alone spent an estimated 150 billion Reichsmarks, a sum that could have rebuilt cities and fed the hungry, but instead fueled the machinery of war. Rosa's opposition to this madness was unwavering, a beacon of sanity in a world gone mad. Despite the gravity of her mission, Rosa never lost her sense of humor. At one Spartacus meeting, when a member suggested they needed a catchy slogan to rally support, she dryly suggested, "How about peace, bread, and land? Oh wait, that's been taken." Her reference to the Bolshevik slogan was a playful jab at the various factions vying for influence, a reminder that originality was as important as passion. Rosa Luxemburg's time in Germany was a whirlwind of activity, a relentless push against the tide of complacency and conformity. Her critiques of the SPD and her opposition to militarism were not mere acts of defiance. They were calls to arms for a generation disillusioned by the failures of the old guard. She understood the power of words and ideas, using them as weapons in her fight for a better world. And while the story doesn't end here, one thing is clear. Rosa Luxemburg was a force to be reckoned with, a revolutionary in both spirit and action. Her legacy is a testament to the power of conviction in the face of overwhelming odds, a reminder that the pen is indeed mightier than the sword, and sometimes even mightier than an entire army. In the grand narrative of revolutionary fervor, Rosa Luxemburg stood as a titan of Marxist theory, a thinker whose pen wielded more power than most armies. But let's not get swept away by romantic notions of a lone heroine in a sea of outdated ideologies. Her journey was a gritty, intellectual battleground where ideas clashed like titans, and she was right in the thick of it, armed with her razor-sharp wit and formidable intellect. Rosa was a staunch believer in the necessity of revolution over reform. To her, the incremental changes proposed by some of her contemporaries, like Edward Bernstein, were about as effective as trying to put out a forest fire with a garden hose. Bernstein's gradualist approach, advocating for piecemeal reforms within the capitalist system, was akin to rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic as far as Rosa was concerned. Her famous retort was that reformism was like trying to square the circle, and she wasn't interested in feudal geometry. Luxemburg's economic writings were a masterclass in the deconstruction of capitalist economies, and perhaps nothing highlights this more than her seminal work, The Accumulation of Capital. Published in 1913, it was her magnum opus, a detailed critique of the capitalist system's insatiable appetite for expansion. She argued that capitalism's survival depended on constant growth and exploitation, not just of its own working class, but also of non-capitalist societies. This expansionist impulse, she warned, would inevitably lead to the colonization and subjugation of less developed nations, a grim prophecy that echoed through the corridors of imperial history. Her debates with fellow Marxists were legendary, a spectacle of intellectual jousting that left witnesses both awed and occasionally bewildered. Take her infamous clash with Lenin, the revolutionary rock star himself. Rosa was skeptical of his vanguard party model, which she feared would lead to authoritarianism. Lenin's idea was that a tightly knit group of professional revolutionaries could guide the working class to victory. Rosa, with her trademark bluntness, argued it was a dictatorship over the proletariat, a stance that didn't win her many friends in Bolshevik circles, but certainly underscored her commitment to democratic socialism. Luxemburg's critiques were not just empty rhetoric. They were backed by a keen understanding of economic realities. She believed that true change required more than just swapping one set of rulers for another. It demanded a complete overhaul of society's structures, a revolution from the ground up. Her stance was clear. Freedom is always the freedom of dissenters. For Rosa, any system that stifled debate and dissent was no better than the tyranny it sought to overthrow. While her theoretical battles were waged in the intellectual salons of Europe, the practical realities of her activism were anything but glamorous. The life of a revolutionary was not all fiery speeches and rallying cries. It was often a slog through the mud of political maneuvering, evading police surveillance and enduring the harsh conditions of imprisonment. Rosa herself spent several stints behind bars, her writings smuggled out like contraband. The romantic image of the revolutionary martyr was far from the truth. It was a life of constant struggle, punctuated by moments of triumph and despair. Luxemburg's dedication to the cause was unwavering, even when it meant standing against those she once allied with. Her critique of the Bolsheviks after the October Revolution was a testament to her integrity. She admired their audacity, but was openly critical of their methods. Without general elections, freedom of press and assembly, unrestricted freedom of opinion, life dies out in every public institution, she argued. Her words were a cautionary tale, a reminder that the means are just as important as the ends. Despite her fiery rhetoric and unyielding stance, Rosa was not immune to the human need for connection and camaraderie. Her letters reveal a woman of deep emotion and vulnerability, often wrestling with the isolation that came with her radical path. She found solace in nature, art, and the companionship of a select few who understood the weight of her mission. Her correspondence is peppered with moments of levity and introspection, revealing a multifaceted personality that defies the simplistic labels of history. Let's not forget her contribution to the understanding of spontaneity in social movements. Rosa argued that revolutions are not the result of meticulously planned conspiracies, but arise spontaneously from the conditions of the masses. Her belief in the power of the proletariat to self-organize was a radical departure from the tightly controlled revolutionary strategies espoused by her contemporaries. It was a bold assertion that history is not always made in the backrooms of party meetings, but often erupts on the streets when people reach their breaking point. Rosa Luxemburg's legacy is a testament to the power of ideas and the unyielding pursuit of justice. Her life was a balancing act between the ideal and the real, the theoretical and the practical. She was a visionary who saw beyond the superficial allure of revolutionary romance, understanding that true change requires not just passion, but perseverance and a deep commitment to the principles of freedom and equality. Her story doesn't end here, but her impact is felt like a ripple through the annals of history, a reminder that the fight for a better world is never a finished battle, but an ongoing journey. As the German Revolution of 1918-1919 erupted, Rosa Luxemburg found herself in the midst of yet another historical maelstrom, ready to lead with the kind of fearless resolve that makes lesser mortals reach for a cup of chamomile tea. You see, Germany was a social and economic tinderbox just waiting for a spark. The country was staggering under the weight of World War I, a conflict that had sucked resources like a high-powered vacuum cleaner on a rampage. By the time the war ended, Germany was about as stable as a wobbly Jenga tower. Now, imagine the chaos. Soldiers returning home to a nation that had promised them glory, but delivered nothing but scars and empty bellies. The war had drained the coffers, and inflation was skyrocketing. Prices of basic goods had increased by over 400% from pre-war levels. The Kaiser had abdicated, leaving a power vacuum big enough to drive a tank through. In this turbulent sea of discontent, Rosa saw not just turmoil, but opportunity, a chance to finally turn the revolutionary theories she cherished into reality. Luxemburg wasn't one to shy away from a crisis. In fact, she seemed to thrive on it, like a political adrenaline junkie. She and her Spartacus League comrades, including the fiery Karl Liebknecht, saw the revolution not as an abstract concept, but as a living, breathing reality that needed guidance. On November 9, 1918, workers took to the streets, demanding change, and declared a general strike, a move that was less about strategic planning and more about sheer desperation. It was a spontaneous upheaval, just the kind of grassroots movement Rosa had always championed. Her role in the revolution was not just as a theoretician, but as a hands-on leader. She could be found rallying workers with speeches that crackled with energy, even as she cautioned against the perils of seizing power without a clear plan. "We're not here to trade one set of chains for another," she warned, a sharp reminder that revolutions without vision were like fireworks, dazzling but ultimately fleeting. But let's not get carried away by romantic notions of revolutionary splendor. The truth is, the German Revolution was a messy affair. The newly formed Weimar Republic was trying to establish order, while leftist factions jostled for influence like kids in a candy store where everything was up for grabs. The Spartacus League was small, numbering only a few thousand, but what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in sheer audacity. Enter the Spartacist uprising of January 1919, a bold but ultimately doomed attempt to wrest control from the moderate social democrats who were steering the nascent republic. Luxemburg, although skeptical of the timing, felt the pull of solidarity with the workers who saw this as their moment. It was a classic case of damned if you do, damned if you don't. The uprising was crushed within weeks by the Freikorps, a paramilitary group that was about as subtle as a sledgehammer and twice as brutal. And here's the kicker. While Luxemburg's mind was as sharp as ever, her body was not immune to the harsh realities of revolutionary life. She was arrested on June 15, 1916, and spent much of the war in prison. But if you think that incarceration would silence her, think again. Her prison letters, which she managed to smuggle out, were full of wit, wisdom, and the occasional dash of humor. One letter to a friend playfully bemoaned the prison food, saying it was either a cunning form of torture or an experiment in sustaining life on minimal nutrition. Even behind bars, she never stopped thinking, writing, or inspiring. Her letters are peppered with observations on everything from politics to natural beauty, reminding us that even revolutionaries need a mental escape. She wrote of the birds she could see from her cell window, describing them with an eye for detail that would make an ornithologist nod in approval. It was a testament to her indomitable spirit, finding beauty in bleakness. Let's not sugarcoat it, though the revolution's failure was a bitter blow. The economic conditions that had fueled it were still a grim reality. Unemployment was rampant, and the Treaty of Versailles was about to drop like a bombshell, demanding reparations that would cripple the German economy for years to come. It was a harsh reminder that even the most well-intentioned revolutions can falter when faced with the cold, hard arithmetic of geopolitics. Yet, through it all, Rosa remained a beacon of hope and resilience. Even as she faced the prospect of rearrest and the harsh reprisals that came with it, she never wavered in her belief in the power of the masses to forge their destiny. Her final writings were a call to arms, urging her fellow revolutionaries to learn from their mistakes and continue the fight for a more just world. In the end, the German Revolution was a complex tapestry of ambition, desperation, and human frailty. Its failure was not just a political setback, but a personal tragedy for Rosa. Yet her legacy is not defined by this defeat, but by the courage and conviction she displayed in the face of overwhelming odds. She taught us that revolutions are not neat, tidy affairs. They're messy, unpredictable, and often heartbreaking. But they're also necessary, a crucial part of the ongoing struggle for freedom and equality. The story doesn't end here, of course. Rosa Luxemburg's life was tragically cut short in January 1919, but her ideas and spirit continue to inspire movements around the world. Her tale is far from over, and her indomitable spirit reminds us that the fight for justice is never truly lost, only postponed. So, stay tuned as we explore the final chapter of her life, a story that resonates with the timeless question, what price freedom? Rosa Luxemburg's journey, tragically cut short in January 1919, was a testament to the indomitable spirit of a woman who refused to conform to the stifling norms of her time. Her assassination, a brutal and cowardly act by the Freikorps, was as shocking as it was symbolic, a grim reminder that those who challenge the status quo often pay the ultimate price. The Freikorps dumped her lifeless body into Berlin's Landwehr Canal, as if trying to wash away the inconvenient truth she represented. But if they thought they could silence her voice, they were sorely mistaken. History has a pesky habit of keeping the echoes of such voices alive. Rosa's death became a rallying cry, her name a banner under which later generations would march. In the political chaos of post-war Germany, she was mythologized, turned into both a martyr and a symbol of unyielding resistance. Yet, as with many who become larger than life, the romanticized tales of her courage and defiance often obscure the gritty reality of her struggle. She wasn't some ethereal figure floating above the fray. She was in the trenches, her hands dirty with the hard work of revolution. Her legacy is a paradox of romanticism and realism. On one hand, she's the fiery revolutionary, the woman who dared to dream of a world where equality reigned supreme and injustice was but a distant memory. On the other hand, she was a pragmatic thinker who understood that revolutions are not fairy tales with guaranteed happy endings. They're messy, complicated affairs that require more than just hope and rhetoric. Her writings, notably in The Accumulation of Capital, laid bare the economic realities driving imperialism and oppression, offering a lens through which to view the 20th century geopolitical landscape. And let's be honest, Rosa was no stranger to controversy. Her critique of Lenin's vanguard party model was a bold stand, a move that ruffled more than a few feathers in the Bolshevik camp. She warned that concentrating power in the hands of a few could lead to tyranny, and history, with its penchant for irony, proved her fears justified more than once. Her advocacy for spontaneous mass action, rather than top-down control, offered a counter-narrative to the rigid structures espoused by her contemporaries. Fast forward a few decades, and you'll find her fingerprints on movements across the world. The New Left of the 1960s, with its emphasis on grassroots activism and participatory democracy, drew heavily from her ideas. Her belief in the power of the masses to enact change resonated with civil rights activists, anti-war protesters, and feminists alike, proving that her vision was not just a relic of a bygone era, but a blueprint for future generations. Rosa's life story continues to be a source of inspiration and debate. Her ideas about capitalism, imperialism, and democracy are as relevant today as they were a century ago, particularly in a world grappling with economic inequality, political polarization, and the specter of authoritarianism. The fact that her name still sparks discussion is a testament to the enduring nature of her contributions to political thought. Yet let's not kid ourselves. The harsh truth of her life shouldn't be whitewashed by the gloss of nostalgia. Her dedication to the cause came at a personal cost. She endured imprisonment, isolation, and ultimately violent death, all reminders that the path of the revolutionary is often a lonely and perilous one. But in accepting these realities, we gain a fuller understanding of the woman behind the legend. In the end, history remembers Rosa Luxemburg not just for her ideas, but for her unyielding courage in the face of adversity. She was a trailblazer, a woman who dared to ask the uncomfortable questions and demand honest answers. Her legacy is a challenge to future generations, to continue the fight for justice, to question the orthodoxies of their time, and to never settle for the easy answers when the hard truths lie just beneath the surface. So, as you tuck into bed tonight, perhaps consider this. The struggle for a better world is a marathon, not a sprint. Rosa Luxemburg ran her leg with furious determination and handed the baton to us. What we do with it is the next chapter in this never-ending story. And maybe, just maybe, there's a bit of Rosa in all of us, waiting to burst forth and demand a world that is not just different, but better. Centuries before Rome flexed its imperial muscles and dominated the Mediterranean like an ancient world heavyweight champ, there was another kid on the Italian peninsula block, the Etruscans. Think of them as the cool, artsy older sibling who got overshadowed by the loud, brash younger brother. If the Romans were the rock stars of ancient history, the Etruscans were the indie band with a cult following that deserved way more credit than they got. Nestled in the lush hills of central Italy, these folks knew a thing or two about trade, and they were cruising the Mediterranean waves, swapping goods long before the Romans even strapped on their sandals. Let's kick things off around 800 BC, when the Etruscans started making waves, literally. Situated in a geographic sweet spot, they occupied a prime slice of real estate bordered by the Tyrrhenian Sea to the west. With such a location, how could they not get into the trade game? Picture this. Their territory sprawled over what we now call Tuscany, stretching down to the Campania region. It's like owning the corner cafe on the busiest street in town. You'd have to work hard not to get customers. But these folks weren't just sitting around waiting for trade to come to them. Oh no, they were proactive. The Etruscans were the OG maritime merchants, setting sail in their sleek ships, which, let's be honest, were the ancient equivalent of Teslas. Innovative, efficient, and a bit of a status symbol. They embraced maritime trade early on, forging connections with places as far-flung as Greece and the Near East. By the time the Romans were still figuring out which end of the sword to hold, the Etruscans were already navigating the high seas with aplomb. What made these Etruscans so alluring to traders across the Mediterranean? Their knack for craftsmanship. Imagine an ancient Etsy store, but instead of quirky handmade jewelry, we're talking about finely crafted bronze goods, luxurious textiles, and pottery that would make your grandmother's china look like a fifth-grade art project. Their artisans were the envy of the ancient world, and their products were highly sought after. This wasn't just about making pretty things. It was about creating items that had both beauty and value, the kind of stuff people would cross seas to get their hands on. Now, let's talk about the economic impact. The Etruscans knew that trade wasn't just about exchanging goods, it was about power. Their control over trade routes meant they could influence the economic landscape of the region. They were like the Wall Street brokers of their time, but with less yelling and more sailing. By dominating the trade networks, they amassed wealth, which they channeled into building magnificent cities like Veii, Tarquinia, and Servidary. These cities weren't just places to live. They were statements of power and sophistication, with architecture that would make even the most jaded Roman raise an eyebrow. But before we romanticize the Etruscans as the benevolent merchants of the sea, let's pull back the curtain a bit. Their society wasn't all sunshine and trade winds. Like any powerful civilization, they had their dark side. The Etruscans were known for their elaborate religious rituals, many of which involved animal sacrifices. And let's not forget their penchant for divination, interpreting the will of the gods through the entrails of animals. Just your everyday ancient pastime, right? It's a reminder that while their trade networks were a symbol of progress, their cultural practices were steeped in tradition, some of which would make a modern audience cringe. Despite their cultural quirks, the Etruscans were undeniably ahead of their time. Their political structure was a loose federation of city-states, each with its own king, yet united by common language and religion. It was a system that worked well for them, allowing for both autonomy and cooperation, a balancing act that would have given modern federal systems a run for their money. By the time the Romans began their aggressive expansion, around 100 BC, the Etruscans had already laid down the blueprint for what a successful, interconnected trade network should look like. The Romans might have been the ones to build the empire, but they were standing on the shoulders of the Etruscans who had set the stage. So next time you think of ancient Italy, spare a thought for the Etruscans, the master traders, the original crafters, the unsung heroes of Mediterranean commerce. The Romans might have written the history books, but the Etruscans were the ones who handed them the pen. So, With the Etruscans setting the scene for the Romans, let's sail into their world of trade, where the Mediterranean wasn't just a sea, but a superhighway of commerce. Our first port of call, Peac. This wasn't just any old port. It was the crown jewel of Etruscan trade, bustling with activity like Times Square on New Year's Eve, but with less confetti and more dark-side dealings. Peac was strategically nestled along the Tyrrhenian coast, a stone's throw from modern-day Santa Severa. This port was a magnet for traders, not only because of its prime location, but also due to its state-of-the-art infrastructure. Well, state of the ancient art, anyway. Now, when we talk about Etruscan trade, we're not just chatting about a few clay parts and some fancy tunics. We're talking about a veritable treasure chest of metals, ceramics, and textiles that would make any ancient trader salivate. Etruscan metals, particularly bronze, were the Rolls-Royce of their time. They sourced copper from the island of Elba and tin from as far away as Cornwall, a distance of over 500 miles, give or take a few nautical mishaps. This ain't your average grocery run. We're talking serious maritime mileage. By blending these metals, they created bronze artifacts that were not just functional, but also status symbols, the kind of thing you'd flaunt at your next toga party. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The Mediterranean, despite its azure allure, was a treacherous beast. Pirates prowled like pesky mosquitoes at a summer barbecue, and the weather could turn from serene to sinister faster than you can say Poseidon's wrath. These weren't just minor hiccups. They were the stuff of logistical nightmares. Navigating these waters was less about smooth cruising and more like playing a game of ancient Frogger, dodging dangers at every turn. Despite these challenges, the Etruscans cast their nets far and wide, establishing trade links with the Greeks and the Near East. Greece, with its bustling markets and insatiable appetite for luxury goods, was a prime trading partner. The Greeks had a thing for Etruscan ceramics, beautifully crafted pieces that were the ancient equivalent of having the latest iPhone. And let's not forget textiles. Etruscan fabrics weren't just about function, they were about flair. These textiles were woven with intricate designs and vibrant dyes, turning heads and emptying wallets from Athens to Alexandria. The economic impact of this trade was monumental. Wealth generated from these exchanges wasn't just lining the pockets of a few elite. It was the lifeblood of Etruscan society. The prosperity from trade funded the construction of grand cities and supported an artisan class that was the envy of the ancient world. These artisans weren't just cogs in the economic machine. They were cultural ambassadors, spreading Etruscan influence across the seas. It's the kind of soft power that would make any modern diplomat green with envy. But let's not get too misty-eyed about this ancient trade fairy tale. The reality was, this wasn't a frictionless exchange of goods and good vibes. Trade was as much about politics as it was about pottery. Control of trade routes was a constant tug-of-war, a high-stakes game that could turn allies into adversaries faster than you can say tribute. And then there were the tariffs and taxes. The Etruscans weren't just savvy traders. They were astute economists, ensuring that every ship docking at Peac paid its dues. This wasn't just about maintaining infrastructure. It was about asserting dominance. The Etruscans' command over their trade networks was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it brought unprecedented wealth and cultural exchange. On the other, it made them a target for envious neighbors and ambitious empires. It's a classic tale as old as time. With great power comes great responsibility and even greater risks. The Etruscans had to constantly adapt, innovate, and defend their turf in a world where alliances could shift as quickly as the Mediterranean tides. So, while it's tempting to romanticize the Etruscans as benevolent traders spreading harmony across the seas, the truth is far more complex. They were shrewd, strategic, and sometimes ruthless in their pursuit of economic dominance. Yet, amid the chaos and competition, they forged a legacy that would outlast their own civilization. A legacy not just of trade routes and treasures, but of cultural connections that would resonate through history. And as we leave Peac behind, remember that this is just one chapter in the epic saga of the Etruscan trade networks. A story with twists, turns, and no shortage of surprises still to come. As we drift away from Peac's bustling docks, let's delve into the diplomatic dance that was Etruscan foreign policy, a cha-cha of alliances and rivalries that would make even the most seasoned politician break a sweat. You see, the Mediterranean was less a serene pool of azure and more a political shark tank. where everyone from the Greeks to the Carthaginians was prowling for a piece of the trade action. And the Etruscans, they were right in the thick of it, navigating these charpy waters with the dexterity of a cat on a hot tin roof. Let's talk alliances first, because in the ancient world, who you knew was just as important as what you traded. The Etruscans were like the social butterflies of the Mediterranean, always mingling, always networking. They cozied up to the Greeks when it suited them, swapping goods and cultural influences like they were trading baseball cards. Etruscan ceramics were all the rage in Greek markets. Think of them as the Louis Vuitton of their day, something every aspiring Athenian had to have on their shelf. But it wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about politics. The Greeks and Etruscans had a symbiotic relationship, each feeding off the other's strengths like ancient frenemies who just couldn't quit each other. But let's not get carried away with visions of ancient harmony. Alliances in the ancient world were as stable as a house of cards in a tornado. And to the Carthaginians, the other big player in this Mediterranean game of thrones, Carthage was a powerhouse, a city-state with a navy that could rival Poseidon's own fleet. The Etruscans knew that while having Carthage as an ally could be beneficial, it was also like dancing with a tiger. One wrong step, and you might end up as lunch. This led to a delicate balancing act, where the Etruscans had to keep their friends close and their frenemies closer. The stakes were high, and it wasn't just about who had the fanciest pottery or the most exotic textiles. Control over trade routes was the real prize, akin to owning the keys to the kingdom. The Etruscans were well aware that their prosperity depended on these routes remaining open and secure. But here's the catch. The more successful they became, the more they attracted the envy and aggression of their neighbors. It's the classic, mo money, mo problems scenario, but with a decidedly ancient twist. Let's zoom in on one of the most dramatic episodes in this saga, the Battle of Alalia, around 540 BC. This wasn't just a skirmish over some forgotten parcel of land. It was a full-blown naval showdown between the Etruscans, allied with the Carthaginians, and the Greek Phaeacians. The Etruscans and Carthaginians emerged victorious, but it was a Peac victory. The battle decimated fleets on both sides and sent ripples through the trade networks. For the Etruscans, it was a stark reminder that controlling trade routes wasn't just about profit. It was a matter of survival. In the aftermath, the political landscape of the Mediterranean shifted like sand in the tide. The Etruscans had to double down on their diplomatic efforts, reinforcing alliances and smoothing over tensions with a deftness that would make today's diplomats envious. Yet, amid the intrigue and power plays, the Etruscans managed to maintain their dominance over these crucial trade routes for centuries. It was a testament to their resilience and adaptability, though it often meant playing a dangerous game of political chess where one false move could spell disaster. Now, let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer absurdity of some of these diplomatic antics. Imagine the Etruscan envoy, draped in his finest toga, schmoozing with Carthaginian leaders one day and hobnobbing with Greek merchants the next. It's the kind of high-stakes negotiation that would leave even the most seasoned politician reaching for the Tylenol. Yet, for the Etruscans, this was all in a day's work. They had to be as charming as they were shrewd, balancing the scales of power with a finesse that would put most modern diplomats to shame. But before we get misty-eyed about their diplomatic genius, let's not forget the harsh realities. The Etruscan trade empire wasn't built on trust and good intentions alone. There were taxes to be levied and tariffs to be enforced, and not everyone was thrilled about it. Imagine being a trader docking at an Etruscan port, only to be greeted by a tax collector with a ledger as long as your arm. It's the kind of welcome that would make anyone reconsider their career choice. Yet, this was the cost of doing business in Etruscan territory, and the price of maintaining control over their precious trade routes. Despite these challenges, the Etruscans managed to keep the wheels of commerce turning, their trade networks humming like a well-oiled machine. But as we've seen, this wasn't just about economic gain. It was about power, influence, and survival in a world where the winds of fortune could shift as unpredictably as the Mediterranean tides. So, as we wrap up this chapter of our Etruscan Odyssey, remember that we're just scratching the surface of their storied history. There's more to come, more twists and turns in this tale of trade, politics, and power. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the mysteries of the Etruscans and their enduring legacy. As we leave the Etruscans juggling their diplomatic dance cards, let's peel back the layers of their society and see how trade painted the cultural canvases of their daily lives. You might think of the Etruscans as the ancient equivalent of today's influencers, with their penchant for all things exotic and luxurious. But here's the kicker. While their neighbors might have been busy trying to conquer each other, the Etruscans were importing the good life, and not just in the form of shiny trinkets. First up, the myth of the Etruscan luxury lifestyle. Picture a society dripping in opulence, where every household might seem like a scene from Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous, Etruscan edition. Gold jewelry, intricate pottery, and lavish banquets were not just occasional treats. They were integral to the Etruscan way of life, or so the legend goes. The reality, not everyone was lounging in luxury. Sure, the elites, those at the top of the social hierarchy, were living it up with imported Greek vases and Phoenician finery, but the average Etruscan was more likely dealing with the mundane realities of daily life, like making sure there was enough grain in the granary to last the winter. Trade brought a kaleidoscope of foreign goods to Etruria, but it also influenced everything from art to architecture. Greek ceramics didn't just hold wine. They held stories and styles that permeated Etruscan culture. Look at their temples, and you'll see columns and capitals that would make any Greek architect nod in approval. And let's not forget the influence of the Near East. If you think fusion cuisine is a modern concept, the Etruscans were mixing cultural flavors long before it was trendy. And then there's the role of women in this bustling society. Forget the tired trope of ancient women as passive bystanders in the grand historical narrative. Etruscan women were far from the silent figures of history's shadows. They were active participants in the social and economic fabric of their time. Evidence suggests that Etruscan women enjoyed a level of freedom that would have made their Greek and Roman counterparts green with envy. They could own property, attend banquets, and even participate in public life. It was a society where women could be seen alongside men in frescoes, not just as decorative afterthoughts, but as equals. Let's bust another myth while we're at it. The idea that Etruscan women were merely ornamental. In reality, they played crucial roles in trade and society. Take the example of the elaborate Etruscan tombs. These were family affairs, not just monuments to individual egos. Women were depicted in these tombs with as much prominence as men, suggesting they were just as crucial to the family's social standing. They weren't just arm candy at the lavish banquets. They were often the linchpins of social gatherings, skilled at the art of diplomacy and networking. The Etruscan penchant for foreign luxuries also fueled a class dynamic that was as rigid as it was opulent. At the top were the aristocrats, whose wealth was measured in the number of Greek craters they could display at their next symposium. These elites were the ones who could afford the luxuries that trade brought in, and they flaunted them like badges of honor. But beneath this glittering surface, the social structure was a bit more complex. There were artisans and craftsmen, whose skills were in high demand thanks to the influx of foreign styles and techniques. These artisans were the unsung heroes of Etruscan society, laboring away to produce the goods that kept the trade networks humming. Yet, even amid this cultural exchange, the Etruscans held onto their own identity with a tenacity that would make a bull terrier proud. They absorbed foreign influences and made them distinctly their own. Their art, a blend of Greek formality and Etruscan vitality, is a testament to their ability to adapt while preserving their unique cultural essence. Now, let's shift our gaze to the broader implications of this trade-fueled cultural exchange. The influx of foreign goods wasn't just about style. It was about status and power. These goods were symbols of prestige that helped cement social hierarchies. Owning a piece of Greek pottery wasn't just about appreciating fine art. It was a statement of wealth and sophistication. It was the ancient version of driving a luxury car through town. Everyone knew what it meant, and everyone knew who could afford it. But with great wealth comes great responsibility, or at least a great deal of societal pressure. The Etruscan elite were expected to maintain their status through public displays of wealth, sponsoring games and religious festivals that were as much about showing off as they were about piety. This was a society where public and private life were intricately entwined, where the boundaries between personal wealth and public duty were as blurred as the lines in an abstract painting. In this milieu, the cultural implications of trade were profound. The Etruscans weren't just importers of goods. They were importers of ideas, technologies, and traditions. These exchanges enriched their society, but also posed challenges, as they had to navigate the tensions between tradition and innovation. It was a balancing act that required the skill of a tightrope walker, and one that was central to the Etruscan identity. So, as we weave through the Etruscan tapestry of trade, culture, and society, remember that this was a civilization that thrived on complexity. They were masters of adaptation, able to integrate foreign influences without losing sight of their own cultural roots. And while their trade networks brought them wealth and power, they also brought the challenges of maintaining a cohesive identity in a world that was constantly shifting. The Etruscans remind us that history is rarely black and white. It's a vibrant mural painted with the hues of human ambition, ingenuity, and adaptation. As we continue to explore the Etruscan world, keep in mind that behind every artifact and every trade route lies a story as rich and intricate as the society that created it. Stay tuned for more revelations as we dive deeper into the Etruscan saga, where the next chapter promises new insights and, no doubt, a few more surprises. And so, as we sail into the final chapter of our Etruscan Odyssey, let's talk about the giant toga-wearing elephant in the room. Rome. Rome, the brash upstart that bullied its way into the Mediterranean club, eventually snatching the crown right off the Etruscans' well-coiffed heads. You see, while the Etruscans were busy weaving their intricate tapestries of trade and culture, Rome was like the ambitious younger sibling, quietly, then not so quietly, gathering strength. By the 4th century BC, the Romans weren't just the new kids on the block, they were the block. The Etruscan decline wasn't a dramatic plunge off a cliff, but more of a slow, inevitable slide into obscurity. Picture this. Around 396 BC, the Romans conquered the Etruscan city of Veii after a 10-year siege. It was a turning point, the beginning of the Romans' methodical absorption of Etruscan territory. Every conquest chipped away at the Etruscan trade networks, like a woodpecker at a once mighty tree. The final nail in the Etruscan coffin, the Battle of Sentinum in 295 BC, part of the Third Samnite War, where Rome decisively crushed its Etruscan and Samnite rivals. It was less a battle and more a statement. Rome was here to stay, and it wasn't sharing. But don't start playing the world's smallest liar for the Etruscans just yet. Their legacy didn't vanish into the annals of history quite so easily. The Romans, with their characteristic efficiency, cherry-picked the best of Etruscan culture and made it their own. Etruscan influence was like the yeast in Rome's cultural bread. You might not see it, but it was essential. Take Roman architecture, for instance. Those grandiose arches and engineering marvels. Thank the Etruscans' mastery of the arch and their practical approach to construction. Even the mighty Roman aqueducts have Etruscan blueprints in their DNA. And let's not overlook the Etruscans' impact on Roman religion. The Etruscans were the ancient equivalent of spiritual mentors to the Romans. They were the ones who introduced the practice of augury, interpreting the will of the gods by observing birds. Sounds like something out of a Harry Potter book, right? But to the Romans, this was serious business. They adopted it with gusto, alongside other Etruscan religious rituals, which became woven into the fabric of Roman spirituality. Even the Roman pantheon bore traces of Etruscan deities, with some gods seamlessly transitioning from Etruscan to Roman worship like seasoned diplomats at a divine mixer. So, while the Romans may have conquered the Etruscans, they didn't obliterate their influence. Instead, they absorbed it, like a cultural sponge, soaking up the best of what came before. The Etruscans were the unsung architects of Roman greatness, their contributions subtly shaping the empire that would define the ancient world. And yet, for all their influence, the Etruscans remained shrouded in mystery, their language still largely undeciphered, their stories told mostly through the lens of their conquerors. This brings us to the grand myth of the Etruscans, that romanticized vision of a noble, lost civilization. It's easy to get swept up in the allure of a society that seemed to blend art, trade, and diplomacy with such finesse. But remember, history's not just a highlight reel of achievements and aesthetic triumphs. The Etruscans, like any society, had their flaws and failures. Their political structure, a loose federation of city-states, was both a strength and a weakness. It allowed for cultural diversity and innovation, but it also lacked the centralized authority that might have resisted Rome's relentless advance. Yet, the romantic appeal of the Etruscans endures. Perhaps it's the allure of the underdog, the civilization that punched above its weight in a world of burgeoning empires. Or maybe it's the mystery that surrounds them, the tantalizing gaps in our understanding that invite speculation and wonder. Whatever the reason, the Etruscans continue to fascinate, their story a testament to the complexity of history, where the lines between legend and reality blur like the colors in a fresco. And so we leave the Etruscans, not as mere footnotes in Roman history, but as integral players in the grand tapestry of the ancient world. They were master traders, skilled artisans, and cultural innovators whose legacy reverberates through time. The next time you marvel at a Roman arch or ponder the intricacies of ancient religion, remember the Etruscans, the indie band that laid the groundwork for the rock stars of antiquity. Their story is a reminder that history isn't just written by the victors, but by all those who dared to shape the world in their image. And while the Etruscans may not have had the last word, they certainly had an enduring voice.